I'm going to call to order the Issaquah City Council Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, October 24th. Welcome, everybody. We have 2 items on our agenda tonight. Actually, we have 3. The 2 agenda items, the first one is district visions regarding the development moratorium. And the second item is a Forterra report, a growth perception survey. And then, as always, at Committee of the Whole meetings, we have reports on regional activities and issues if any council members have any reports. So let's start with the first item, district vision regarding the development moratorium, presented by Trish Heinonen, Policy Planning Manager.
Okay. There we are. This is, I think, your second touch of the neighborhood visions, and I just wanted to remind you, why is it a moratorium item? And what we heard from you all is you wanted us to revisit the visions to make sure, to find out what's missing. Was there anything that we forgot? Why are things not happening like we thought they might happen? To add more details, more predictability, some stronger language. We still are using the existing evaluation in the existing visions, but you had asked us to add some architectural style, green necklace as a separate category, and placemaking. So this has been the vision journey so far. This has been, it's a treasure hunt, as you can see, and the treasure being when we implement the visions and when Central turns out to be the place that we all want it to be. And so we started out over in the corner with the moratorium began, and we started meeting with focus groups of property owners and business owners in the 10 neighborhoods. And we heard a lot of really interesting information from them. Then we had a PPC open house, and we heard a lot of information from the community. We had a lot of boards, a lot of pictures, a lot of things to get people thinking about what it could be, what it might be, what it should not be. And so we gathered that. Then we had a reunion of the task force, which was pretty exciting, to get them back together and have them contemplate what they thought was going to happen and what did happen. And then we had 2 community meetings. One was in Atlas, which was fun to meet a lot of new residents that had never been here through Central Issaquah planning process and were just new and loved a lot of what we already had going. So that was really a fun one. And then the Pickering Barn was another community meeting that we had. And now we've been working through a lot of the information, and now we're coming to you all for a couple of touches with the Committee of the Whole Council. We're going to be meeting with Land and Shore a few times. We're going to meet with PPC for the public hearing, and we've got that scheduled for 2 nights so they can really chew it and ponder it and give you guys a really great recommendation at the end of November. And then it'll be up to you to review it and do what you need to do with it. And then we're hoping to be done by the end of December, but that's totally up to whatever shape it's in when you see it and what changes or ideas that you have. Just as to show you an example, the district visions, the existing, are on the one side, and there are 2 district visions there. So you can see from the new page and the new format, there's a lot more information in the new vision, including implementation strategies to sort of make it real and alive, and what we need to do, what are the steps we need to do to bring the districts into fruition. One of the issues that we found when we talked to the property owners and business owners and then a lot of the residents, because there's not a lot of residents actually there now, but each of the 10 neighborhoods, they wanted to be different. They wanted to be distinct. They wanted to have a unique quality that was all their own. And that's a little challenging because a lot of them are really similar. So we really had to ponder and talk to the businesses and property owners and the community. Well, what would be the distinctive piece of this neighborhood or that neighborhood? And so we had some really great discussions. We're not done yet. We're still talking to some of the departments on their ideas and their plans, and specifically parks, because of course they've got the strategic plan moving forward. The thought of trying to make each neighborhood distinctive and special was part of this whole journey. So we've got that, but again, it probably won't stay that way because it's still evolving. We still have over a month before public hearing, so we've got some time to get your thoughts as well on how close or far away we are. If we only had to throw out a few words on what's different for all the neighborhoods, this would be sort of a overall, this is what we heard as special, unique, distinctive parts of the neighborhoods. A lot of it was wayfinding. They wanted people to be able to get there, either to shop at their places, to find the trails, to find the special places. So wayfinding was a big one. Branding was big in several of them, that not only, the uniqueness piece, and I know we're hoping to work on those kinds of things next year. A lot of it was parks and gathering places, to make each of them special in a different way. Some of them were connectivity. They wanted to be better connected to their neighborhoods or to the state park. Amazingly, a lot of them wanted to, even if they weren't next to the state park, they wanted to be associated with the state park, even if the boundaries didn't touch. So we tried to make them all unique and special. I'm going to go through all of them at a super high level, just to sort of get you going into pondering, did we hit them, did we not hit them, is there something huge that's missing, is there something little that you want to throw in there for us to think about? I feel a comment coming on? No? Okay. The big vision. It includes big pieces like it includes the Regional Growth Center. We want it to be a balance of jobs and housing. That's pretty much the same. We want it to redevelop as sustainable. It has to be multimodal and rely on all sorts of ways of getting around to be successful. The daily needs are important to be able to get there without the use of a vehicle if possible. And then making sure the green necklace is a lot more understandable and a visual piece of the whole central Issaquah as it goes into the rest of the city. And then these implementation strategies are big picture, so they would cover all of the neighborhoods, but there are also specific implementation in each neighborhood as well. These are pretty logical. Regional traffic, keep trying to figure that out because it affects several of the neighborhoods. Figuring out a master mobility plan that works on the last mile for transit for all the neighborhoods, making sure that all the gaps are filled in for like Mountains to Sound, the sidewalks in all the area, all those kinds of things. And then the placemaking would be the green necklace, the gateway and wayfinding kinds of things. Also, of course, as we always do, there's an administrative part to monitor the strategies every year like we do for Central.
So Trish, that's the
Yes.
So that's the overview.
That's the whole
Okay.
Central.
And then you would start off with the individual
The
districts?
individual neighborhoods, if you would like.
Okay.
Do you want to go there?
No, I'm just
Okay.
making sure council members know that they can ask questions throughout.
Okay.
I think you wanted to make it all the way through. Sometimes it's easier to just kind of question as we go.
Sure.
So this is the overview part, and then we're going to go off into specific districts. I was just going to make sure,
Okay.
or see if anybody has any questions here.
Okay.
So just on the overview piece, Trish, I like the new format that you've gone to, and I guess that came out of the stakeholder process. But I think the vision statement and then having it all under the categories was pretty good. Generally speaking, when we get to each single strategy, they seem to be all written in a slightly different tone or something. And I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about underneath those categories that you're talking about, is the format supposed to be where we are in that district and where we want to go near term, long term, or what were you trying to accomplish under each of those sections?
Right. Good question. I'm going to jump back to what we tried to do in the, do the arrows work? What we tried to do in the big, we kept calling this the big vision, let's say the big vision for Pickering, was this was supposed to sort of touch on the big pieces that we would want in the future, maybe starting with some existing conditions sort of to know where you're anchored, but then to move into what we would want for that area. And then underneath here, where's my cursor? These were supposed to flesh out the pieces that were described here, so there's a little more information in these. And then if there were any things that were the future that we didn't either have already programmed, had in a budget, had in a TIP, then they would come down here as implementation, is how we had hoped that it would flow.
Okay, so in the big vision itself, there's a lot of language that says Central Issaquah is, but actually it's more about what it could be. So it says things like Central Issaquah is an RGC that, and then instead of saying it will do something, the whole way the vision is written is like it's already there.
Okay.
And I carried that through to the area will be multimodal, Central Issaquah will support. So there's a little confusion in the overall vision statement
Okay.
of where we're starting from and where we're going to
Okay.
go to. And another question on the overall part, it said that each section will preserve its connection to cultural and historical fabric. And I read that in the overall vision, but can you tell me how that links underneath the categories that you did for each vision?
Right, and that one goes to the piece, there was part of the Pickering Farm is historic, and we're definitely keeping that as a main piece of the Pickering vision. We mentioned Gilman Village, came up a lot as somehow keeping Gilman Village. We thought, well, we'll see how that plays to try to preserve it. And if that's too far, then you all can say, that's too far. We don't want to, buy it, preserve it, whatever. But we tried to pick out the pieces, like Mountains to Sound has been there a long time, and so that's sort of a key for us. But that's what we wanted to try to strengthen, that we have those cultural and historic pieces in here in the central area, and we want to move forward, but keep those.
And are they in every district, or was it just an overarching concept? It sounded like it was something we were striving to do in each district, but I couldn't find it in each district.
Right, and I guess it's in several of them, but it's not in all of them. But that's a good point. We should tie that up better.
I have a few more questions. We can let somebody else go.
Your questions?
This one on the primary use categories. Primary use categories, there's some general language in the vision that talks about reasonable balances. And I'm wondering how to quantify that. So are there job, housing, ratio goals for different districts? So that if we're trying to keep a reasonable balance, how would we track and measure that in each district?
Right. I think that's an aspirational goal, knowing that some of them don't have housing yet, and so we're hoping through either some of the housing strategies or through, vertical mixed use that's supposed to pull in some more housing in that area, that we'll start to have a better balance of jobs and housing moving forward. But no, there's not a specific, if we get this many jobs, we stop until we get housing. It wasn't something like that.
A sort of slightly different question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Each district is different. Is there a jobs housing ratio?
No.
We talk about it generally, but if each district has its own characteristic, is one of them got a jobs housing ratio of this, that's what we're shooting for, and the other one, say it's the Rowley piece on the west side of 90, is that got a different ratio, and how do we know that we have things in balance, or how do the different districts differ by the jobs housing ratio?
Right, and to answer the first question is no, they don't have specific jobs housing balance. I think part of what we were saying when we set a balance is because we're monitoring every year, and sort of how the council stopped things when we realized that some things like affordable housing, we weren't getting any in the third year. By the third year, that we sort of had to say, this is not an appropriate balance. We're not getting any. So I think we put that in there, so that's a mark to start checking against, that if it all goes one way, that we'll know that we're doing something wrong because there's not a balance. But no, there's no specific balance in any of the neighborhoods.
One last question on that then. Take, for example, Gateway Neighborhood. It originally had a description that said jobs and housing co-located, and it got built without the jobs.
Right.
So that wasn't discussed as any part of the visions, that this neighborhood would be mostly residential and this one would be mostly office and this one would be a mix. We didn't differentiate characteristics of each neighborhood by that?
Not in that many words, no.
Okay.
Any other questions on the main vision? Pickering. And again, we tried to think of something that was unique about each of and that would be in green. Not that these are going to stick. These were our first tries at trying to make them unique, and what we felt with Pickering is it's connected to just about everything. And so it's got a really great trail system already, and it has potential to be even better connected, not only to the state park to the north, but to East Lake Sammamish Trail all the way north to all the trails to the south. So we called this one Connections. And obviously, it's anchored by Costco's international headquarters. It's going to have convenient access to the Sound Transit Light Rail Station because we figure it's going to be really close to this neighborhood. And the implementation strategies, as you can see, most of them are mobility related, with one that's primary use related is to try to fix that, the property covenants to allow residential in where PCC is. Are there any questions on Pickering?
Under the mobility, Sound Transit Light Rail Station Preference Study. Can you talk about that?
A lot of the comments that we got, not only from the property owners and business owners, but from the public is, when are we going to figure out where it goes? When are we going to look at the criteria for how we decide where that goes? And so instead of deciding ourselves in the vision process where it goes, we thought that's an implementation is we need to start as a community figuring out where that goes. You know, do we want it north? Do we want it south? Do we want it on the right-of-way? Do we want it somewhere else? But that came out in all of the discussions that we had is, when are we going to figure that out as a community?
So that's not in, where does Sound Transit Light Rail Station Preference Study show up under mobility in other districts, or is it just this one?
I think the one to the south, Tibbetts, thank you. Because we figure it's going to be perhaps somewhere in there. But it could also go in the overriding central implementation as well. If you didn't want to make it a neighborhood implementation, it could go up into the big overriding one as part of central.
Because unless I'm forgetting, I don't think we've had that conversation yet, right?
Right. Well, in the central plan, there's what we call the slug map that kind of shows the little places it might be that we thought of way back 4 years ago now. And this would just be narrowing it down to where the little slug pods are.
So Trish, the center of this right now, the water feature, is that actually a storm utility feature?
Yes.
So it's not really talked about in here, either that it's going to stay or that development would be oriented toward it, or, so is it going to stay?
Yes, I thought we called it,
And that's okay.
I thought we called it the Pickering, the pond.
Okay.
But maybe that was a previous, but as far as we know, it's going to stay, and it's,
So we could actually make it stay by just saying it has to stay.
right. It's under Green Necklace?
The Costco pond ramp.
Thank you. Yeah, it is still in there, yay. It's under Green Necklace and Parks.
Okay, but it's a privately owned park. Is it owned by Costco or the other half of the development, or both?
It's owned by Pickering.
It's owned by Pickering,
It's owned by the other half.
the other
Like,
half.
It's not owned by the land that's under control of Costco. It's owned by the other group there.
Both.
It is owned by both.
Keith is saying both.
Okay, well, just a bookmark that I thought, it doesn't seem that it's clearly going to stay. It doesn't seem that it's actually is the central gathering area. So that was just one comment. The other was, and this kind of goes general through the whole thing, work with the neighborhood to create public gathering places. That didn't sit well with me, mostly because I actually think we ought to have this figured out so that when they're coming, we're actually saying the plan for this neighborhood includes, instead of saying, I hope you can help us do this.
Right.
And this is kind of throughout all of the visions, is it says we'll work with the neighborhood to figure things out. I actually think what we need to do is have a plan so that when somebody comes to the table, they know what can happen. It seemed a little too hopeful and aspirational, and maybe not actually going to happen.
Right. And we hope to do a little bit of that through the Park Strategic Plan on the ones that are publicly, that we would publicly help them with. But the privately done ones, we want to take another swing at that, because the first time we tried it. We know we need to fix the development regs for how you do parks and when they're privately owned. And so that's a whole implementation piece that we know that we have to do. But point well taken is we were trying to show the partnership that that goes into making a community space or whether it's public or private, that we need to work together to make sure they turn out the way we all want them to turn out.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think I understand the intent of what you're
Right.
doing, but 12 buildings in and 12 already on the way is 24 before we figured it out. And so
Right.
at this point, I think we actually need to really say what we're going to do. Otherwise, we go back out with an aspirational document and we get what we get. So I didn't think the language was strong enough.
Other questions? Comments?
Any others for Pickering? Gateway, the green corridor. Most of these talk about the trailhead, the boardwalk, the neighborhood park, the need for being able to get to daily services. A lot of the implementations are, again, mobility related. And figuring out a gateway feature. We figure that's in the name. We really need to do that as a city, is to figure out what it is, where it goes, how we're all going to figure out how to pay for it. So that's one of the implementation. And also to work with WashDOT on noise abatement for that neighborhood. Questions on?
Your gateway, it talks, I think it's the new language, talks about employees in Western Gateway, and it uses the words mixed density versus mixed use. So I think originally the vision had mixed use. What is mixed density, and what is the employment sector? Is that just the arena sports?
Well, there's still some properties there that haven't committed to anything yet, and maybe when they redevelop, we would get something that wasn't residential. We're not sure. It could happen. I think the mixed density was to show that some of them are more townhouse-like, some of them are multifamily, some of them are lower density, to show that it's not just a South Cove that's all the same, low density, single-family, detached, that it's more of a mix of densities in this one neighborhood. But it is mostly residential, as you said.
Do we use the word mixed density in our other neighborhoods too? Or is that the unique character of this neighborhood? That it's
I think
mixed
that's one of the
density?
unique characters, is there's so many different kinds of single family so far in here, in this neighborhood. Or not of single family, of residential density.
It also under mobility talked about doing a non-vehicle crossing of I-90, but it didn't say much about that. So how do we get that if most of that area has been built out? How do we actually get that crossing?
I think that would be what we would work on. It's in the, either through the master mobility plan or through, there's a non-motorized crossing in the existing central plan now. But we would just continue to try and figure out how do we get folks across.
We also preserved a place on Gateway, so there's a landing.
Oh, and we've also preserved a place in Gateway, so there's a landing for that crossing at some future time.
It would be both a benefit to those that live here and a big benefit to the neighborhood, but why didn't growth pay for any of it? Why is it just on our TIP? Why isn't it part of the vision for this neighborhood, that as that neighborhood gets created, they actually pay for a part of, or if not all of that connection?
Did they, when we saved the landing spot, was that ours or was that part of the property owner?
It's not part of the TIP. It's not on the TIP.
Okay. Keith's saying it's not on the TIP.
Cultural historical connection and gateway feature. Shouldn't the gateway feature have been done? Like, this neighborhood is going to be 75% done. Is the gateway feature for this neighborhood on the taxpayers instead of those property owners that are building the new gateway neighborhood?
That would be something we'd figure out. Maybe we would figure out another way to pay for it. Maybe we just thought, because people talk about a gateway, that we need to explore what that is. And maybe it turns out that it doesn't work out and we can't figure out how to put a gateway there. Or maybe we get donations of an art something for that area. Or we just wanted to explore it because we didn't have that in the original plan, as how to get it.
It's not required. It won't be,
No.
when we get out of the moratorium, it won't be required.
No, because this isn't code. But the implementation is to figure out, to talk about a gateway plan, to figure out, is there a way to require it? Is there a way to raise funds for it through another mechanism? I mean, that would be part of what we would explore.
Right?
Just to follow up on that, the gateway, it's called a gateway feature, so it's just been talked about as a feature, not a different kind of structure or something that would-
Correct.
Okay.
And typically, they can be anything from, a fountain, art, a certain kind of trees. I mean, it can be, there's a wide range of gateway features, and we didn't want to put it in a box that it had to be A through Z. We wanted to leave it open. We might get the Arts Commission involved. We thought we should explore it.
And is the area for that already
No.
designated?
No, we would, hopefully, we'd figure that all out when we figured out the feature.
Thanks.
HYLA, social engagement. When we were reading over the goals in the development agreement, so much of it was around people and families and people getting together to be there and to be in the natural area and build with nature and be together. And so this is what we decided for, and again, these are all just starting out places. It's a destination place. It's got robust commercial and jobs and all sorts of things. And the key features is to finish the gateway plan, and the mobility is, again, to work on the last mile to make sure that that there's abilities to get to transit, crossing SR 900. Are there questions on? Sure.
Could you talk about the Tibbetts Greenway? This is the first reference I've seen of this.
The Tibbetts Greenway plan was done a long time ago, and a lot of it's done already. There's still a piece that's not done, and it's in the development agreement that we're working with the Rowleys to finish that part. The specifics of the plan, the parts that need to be finished, I'd have to look that up to see the pieces.
How much?
But there's not much of it that.
Just describe it in general.
So the Tibbetts Greenway plan was a public and private effort to return Tibbetts Greenway to a more natural stream corridor. What had happened with Tibbetts over the years is there were coal mine tailings, it was put in a ditch, there was all sorts of kind of infringements on the natural stream corridor. And so what's happened is, so the Rowleys have moved forward and done a big piece of the Greenway. The city has done a big piece of the Greenway. The master developer of Talus did a piece of the Greenway, and so we have a piece left. And if you kind of walk down at the kind of north end of Hyla, Tibbetts is still in an old farming ditch, basically. And the idea is it would actually push it to the west and put it in more of a natural setting. And so that's a piece of environmental improvement that's still to be done.
Okay, thank you. I would just ask that maybe just by reference, provide a little bit more or a link out or some type of reference to more information about this. It comes across as very significant. It is significant. There's been quite a bit done. There is probably some type of roadmap or work plan at whatever level. Just somehow include that additional information. And then just and also the last question about that is how much that. So I think Keith, you did address this. You said it's public-private. And do we know what that breakdown is? Just how much of it was on private land or cross private land, and how much of it was public?
We can get that information for upcoming conversations. So
Yeah,
I don't have it today.
Okay, and that's fine. I know we're going to have some other chances. It's interesting information, I think, to take in part of the bigger picture. So if you can get your hands on that, I'd appreciate that very much. I'd like to know kind of what that breakdown is and if it's different kind of if there are multiple jurisdictions that are public or landowners, just what is the scope of that, and what is the public-private breakdown in terms of parcels and overall project work? Sure. Thank you.
More
Tricia,
questions on Highland?
Follow
Yes.
up on that. On the Gateway neighborhood and Highland neighborhood, do they share part of the Tibbetts Creek Greenway? And do we have the same sort of public-private partnership for preservation of the piece of Tibbetts that is for both of those different neighborhoods?
As far as I know, Gateway, the Western Gateway isn't responsible for any of it. Is that right?
But the corridor
That's
is
not
on
right.
there?
You're shaking your head this way.
So this piece, so right at Newport, this piece of Tibbetts was already done by the city. The piece that's at the northern end, it'll actually be on, this is more of a complicated conversation. So Gateway is deeding property to the city at the east end of their property. Kind of the wetland area and the boardwalk is going to ultimately be on property that's going to be conveyed to the city. That is the property that wants the relocation of the Tibbetts Creek will go on that property. So ultimately, it'll be on property that'll be owned by the city. I don't know if that answered your question.
Does,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you. Anything else on Hyla?
Mariah?
So just wanted to ask, in regard to Hyla, under the implementation strategies, up above, under placemaking, it talks about whimsical and inviting community space. And so I just didn't see anything down below under implementation strategies, and wanted to know if that had been discussed.
Right, the whimsical, that's right out of their development agreement, and we liked it a lot, so we wanted to put it in the vision. But because they're already bound, the city and Raleigh are bound to the development agreement, it's not an implementation per se that they have to develop in a whimsy, but we wanted to put that for the language that describes it. Does that?
Yeah, my question was more just about the focus on the community space and what, if that had been talked about, where.
Right, it's in the development agreement.
Okay.
It's pretty well defined as such a strong, it's pretty well figured out in the development agreement where everything's supposed to go.
Okay. Thank you.
So Trish, under the Hyla Development Agreement, there are a couple of things that have already been built. And one thing that doesn't really come across in this vision compared to the other ones is that we have one property owner who is in control of all of it. And so in the vision, they can create those whimsical, special social places between buildings because they have a desire and interest to do so. How do you capture that in another neighborhood where you have 7 properties and the spaces between the property typically have fences to separate them or whatever? How do you create that same community vibrancy and great social spaces between places when you have multiple property owners versus one property owner?
Right, and we tried to identify the one property owner in the first line of the vision where we say consistent with the Raleigh Development Agreement. So it's real clear that that's how you say it is. It's just one group that's working on that. I think for the other neighborhoods that have many property owners, part of it is to make sure that the trails and the connectivity and the placemaking, that we make it more inclusive and cozy versus the fences, and part of that will have to be in relooking at the development regulations to make sure that it's easier for them to make it an inclusive, social realm kind of a place versus this is my property and that's your property. So I think part of it's the development regs, but part of it is in the placemaking discussions and the trail connectivity discussions.
I think that's not coming across in the descriptions. I think we took it for granted that we're going to get it at Hyla because we have one owner and they've actually have gone out of their way to create it. But I don't think we're going to necessarily get it in those other neighborhoods because it's not in the vision statement about getting the property owners to create these spaces together or getting the property owners to buy into a neighborhood vision and execute on it. It's not there, and it's here. And here I like it because we have a development agreement. We're going to get it. I have concerns that not stating it more strongly in other neighborhood visions means we'll get fences and parking lots that are grade separated and all kinds of stuff because each lot does its own thing. So you don't kind of get that community spaces. So the whole placemaking thing has to be kind of defined a little differently than it is for HYLA. HYLA, I think, is easy because it's under an agreement.
Okay. Other comments for Hyla? Sammamish Park is state park extension. They felt very lucky that they actually did have one of their whole boundaries as the state park, so they wanted to use it as much as they could for their advantage. One of the implementations is to work with the DNR offices, which are the farthest to the west, to see if, when they redevelop, if they can do some higher density, do some different configurations with that, and also to help with mobility to make the park even more accessible to everybody to the south, as well as just interconnect the neighborhood a little better with the state park. And again, this is another idea about a gateway feature, to see if we can figure that out, because the state park is such a big deal for Issaquah to now have that in our jurisdiction, and this is sort of the closest neighborhood to that this might be a really great place for a gateway as well. There questions on Sammamish Park?
So why isn't this one mentioned for light rail?
I think because the slug map is more to the east, and again, I think from your first comment, maybe we put the light rail as a bigger question for the whole central area, to not narrow it down yet. I think we were just in our heads narrowing it down to the two farther south or farther east.
Okay, that sounds good. And then how does this take into account that State Park might relocate their entrance and access? How does that affect the relationship between this parcel and the State
I think
Park?
this still talks about to improve the pedestrian connections in the mobility piece, because maybe that's how they improve it, is they move it, or we figure that out. But that's part of what the mobility piece is alluding to, are there things we need to do to make it easier to get across the street to the state park?
And the uniqueness of it, this particular neighborhood, is proximity
Is
to
that
the
it's
park?
right there. They hope that people would think that it's part of the state park. They would
So
like
in
that
the-
to be just an extension of it.
And so then in the vision, if I'm a owner of one of those buildings or one of those pieces, what do I see in the vision that tells me how I connect to the park? Are we expecting that residential will be next to the park and office would be next to the highway? Or how does this neighborhood work?
Well, I think it says that as an extension, it's going to have relationships between the built and natural environment. It's going to connect to its other neighbors. It could have residential, and it would be great for people that want easy, walkable, bikeable access to the park and daily services. I don't think we're being prescriptive on what has to happen. We're saying that it will have multifamily. We're being hopeful that we would get multifamily there because people would want to live right there and have such great access. We're not mandating it as a use, but it would be a great place, I think, for residential.
Other questions or comments?
Tibbetts Valley, the transportation hub. This is going to have, obviously, it still has the transit center. It's in the mix for transit-oriented development. It'll have vertical mixed use. It's got the dense neighborhoods of the area. It has all the pieces and parts to just be the transportation place. And so part of it is mobility, to make sure that that we have a vision for Gilman Boulevard, a vision for Mall Street, and again, the Sound Transit preference study is in this one, and we'll move that out to the bigger picture. And this has also got the I-90 crossing in it to figure that out as one of the implementations. Questions on Tibbetts Valley? Eastlake, the natural backdrop. This one is one of the few that has existing residential in it. They wanted to have strong connections to the state park, even the parts of it that were across the street. They wanted easier connections across the street, across Eastlake Sammamish to get to the state park. So a lot of the implementation is mobility. And placemaking, they wanted, especially those on the other side, the east side of Eastlake Sammamish wanted better wayfinding and to be able, so people could find them, and the people that worked there and lived there could figure out how to get to the state park and how to get around. The office folks on the west side said sometimes they're hard to find, and so they would like some better wayfinding as well, and they liked the idea that they're so close to the park, but a lot of their people in their offices didn't realize that the park is right there behind them, or to the west of them, because there's no entrance, there's no, it's just sort of a very subtle entrance to the state park from that side, and they would like that to be bigger, better, and more be able to be used more. Questions on Eastlake? Yes.
The crossings of Eastlake Sammamish, are they going to be built by developers, or are they going to be put on our transportation improvement plan?
This doesn't say, it just says that we need them and we should figure it out. And is it part of, we've just done Eastlake Sammamish from 56 South. Oh, I'm getting the hook.
No, you're not. So I think part of what we're trying to do with this is create that predictability so that when we work with developers, so let's assume BMC redevelops as a neighborhood, as a residential neighborhood, and what we've done in the vision is we've said one of the priorities for this neighborhood is this connectivity across Eastlake Sammamish, right? And so now we have a tool in our toolbox to say to whichever developer develops in that place, hey, getting your residents across Eastlake Sammamish is your priority, right? And so now when we get the traffic analysis, we can look specifically for that. And so my expectation is if we seed this plan correctly, I think a lot of these things can be then part of the development activity and cost, as opposed to putting it on the city's TIP or non-motorized TIP at a later date.
So Keith, I think you can sort of hear it in a lot of the questions that I have. If I look at the rally agreement and I look at the graphics that they show, these kinds of things are shown. There's arrows that say, this to me is still really hard to get my head around because it's a lot of wish list, but it doesn't actually show you how the neighborhood works. And so we already know the school district is interested in doing something there, and we already know somebody else was interested in doing something there, and we have nothing to show them. So will we end up in our district visioning with similar figures to what we've seen in other planning tools where you actually see where those crossings could be and how people would move? Because otherwise I feel like we're just throwing darts at a dartboard again, and we hope we'll get it.
Well, I guess I think we need to talk that through a little bit more in terms of kind of how far we can prescribe things. I mean, I think part of this is, if we believe that getting residents from the east side of Eastlake Sammamish to the west side so that they can go to the state park is a priority, then the question is how many crossings do you need? Maybe one, maybe two. I think some of it's going to depend on how many units you're putting in, and are we just talking about redevelopment of BMC, or is it also redevelopment of where Value Village is, right? And so I think some of those variables, whereas with a master developer in a development agreement, they're willing to go ahead and prescribe because they have an idea of how many units they're going to build, and so there's a little bit more of a recipe that's already known. Here, it's still kind of a wide open, the densities that's allowed by zoning are very wide. Whether some of those projects get built as maybe single-family townhouses or apartments, we don't know the answer to that right now. And so I guess what I would say is what's important with the vision piece is at least setting up that expectation that you're going to facilitate those crossings. How and how many, I think that I would be inclined to leave that to, let's see what we get. But
Yeah, okay, so let's stay there just for a second.
Sure.
So in terms of how many and who pays for it, I get you. But in terms of urban planning, we ought to have this figured out. Whether it's townhouses or houses, there's something that's going to happen. And my big concern is we're going to relieve the moratorium, and people are going to come in the door, and we're going to lose opportunities again. So whether or not it should be our TIP and our impact fees should be higher, or whether it's part of building in central Issaquah, and there's a whole series of improvements that benefit some existing residents and a lot of new residents, it's nowhere right now. There's no concept, there's no flow, and it is going to come in bits and pieces, but I feel like the taxpayers are just going to end up picking up a whole bunch of stuff on the TIP. And so I wanted something more in the graphics and not prescriptive, not 3 crossings, but something.
So I'll go back to the slide which shows what we used to have for this neighborhood, which is about a paragraph, right? So let me. So I think we're moving down to, and the question is how far down do we go? And I think part of the conversations that we're going to have at committee level at PPC, I think as Trish mentioned earlier, we still have kind of a month and a half to kind of dial this in at a spot where we all feel good. And if some of the direction that I'm hearing is you want that dialed a little bit farther, I need to have a conversation with Public Works Engineering about that.
That's a great answer. Thanks.
Any more on Eastlake? Darst Park, the trail hub. This has all the great trails coming through it, and we thought, what better thing to do for this neighborhood than have some sort of a wayfinding covered area where, you know, you're on your bike, you're walking, you're at the crossroads, you want to figure out how far is it to Redmond, how far is it to Gilman Village, how far is it to the state park. And this would be a great place because it's got so many of the regional trails and our trails all in one spot. So we named this the Trail Hub. A lot of the implementation pieces are mobility and placemaking, as well as the key environmental feature to work with the property owner to revegetate the hillside there. Are there questions on Darst Park? Yes.
Doesn't mention hillside overlay, which is, I think, something we were talking about. This is one of the few places an actual hillside overlay might apply if we adopt it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm getting a nod. Any other questions or thoughts on Darst? The People Magnet, Gilman. This is a great area. This is so diverse with uses and event kinds of things that all we could think of was that it's a magnet for all things that happen day and night. It's the nighttime activity place. A lot of the comments that we heard from property owners and businesses and the community were there's no places to hang out in the evening. There's not that many, and we need more of a lively night kind of places. And so this was going to be one of those, and we need to work on, again, the Gilman Boulevard's vision, figure out the Promenade Park, or whatever we should call it, in the Park Strategic Plan as we're working on that, and then increasing residential density when housing starts to come in. Are there questions on Gilman?
Mariah?
Just a comment. I really like under placemaking seeing the preservation of Gilman Village listed there.
We thought we'd throw that out there and see what kind of, because we sure heard a lot about that.
Trish?
Yes.
Gilman, People Magnet, on every single one of these, you have a little description.
Yeah.
And I don't see it in the packet. I was wondering if the plan to include that also in the visioning, or is that just for illustrative purposes?
I think we were trying to, I don't think we thought that through yet. We were just trying to think of what would, if you could only describe it in 1 or 2 words, what would be the thing that would grab somebody that goes, oh yeah, Gilman, that's where all the people go. That's where the, we haven't, as I said, we're early in that part of it to know whether or not. Do you think it's helpful, or do you think it's distracting, or any thoughts?
I think it's interesting. I haven't thought it through yet.
Okay.
But if there is a decision to go with that kind of a short descriptor, would make sure that then it carries through, so that when you're reading it, if you kept, if you didn't have that there and you had somebody read it and say, well, what do you think of when you read the vision for the,
Right.
see if they come up with anything close to people magnet.
Right, okay.
So they need to match.
Right, sort of a backup to see if you get there from the other way. It's sort of a,
No question too, Trish. So one thing that might help in a version further down the line is that under the different elements, I think it would help if there was like a bullet point list of what we have now, say under the green necklace, and also what we want to get, short-term, near-term, long-term, but also sort of showing where that is on the little figure. It's really hard to, if you're a resident and you don't know where the creek is in this picture, for example, I know where it is, and I know there's a little piece of a park built there. How do you even picture this in your head, what it's going to look like? And so I'm not sure how you would do that, but it's kind of hard to get to the vision piece unless you're like really familiar with all the landforms. And I guess the second part is we've had experience in this neighborhood with maybe 3 multi-family housing developments so far that all have created no interconnected spaces, meaning developed like individual projects, come to this property, park here, leave type developments. So we're 3 in. I'm not sure what else is going to get done under the moratorium, but how do we get to this thing of creating this neighborhood with these plazas and these connected, even connected private spaces? Like, for example, Atlas on Lotus has a back of the building look, and we know right across the street someone's going to build a building that looks at the back of a building. There should have been an opportunity at corners and on major streets to have created something to integrate with the project across the street, and I don't really see that in here, where if I'm a developer and I want to build on one of those parcels, I don't sense that you're going to ask me to do that. It doesn't show up here, and that's sort of been one of the complaints about some of the developments that have come. And by that, I think if people don't know of a great example, because there is one in Central Issaquah, it is the space between the 2 Rowley hotels that is part of neither and a connection for both. And it's fantastic, and it's what we want, and we could use a picture of it, and we're not getting it. And I don't think if I read this vision, I see that that's required or desirable.
okay. Great. Any other thoughts, comments on this one? Service. This is the trail gateway. This is where the High Point Trail would come through, and the folks here, when we met with them, they said, no one knows where we are. There's nothing that we know of that is really special and great. And you got the High Point Trail. And so we thought, how would we make this part of the High Point Trail a really great spot if you're a hiker or biker? Why would you want to make sure that this is part of your day trip? And so we thought it would be cool to have art there. And maybe it's art that reflects the industrial manufacturing flavor of the area and is really cool and whimsy and mechanical, or maybe it turns out to be something else, but we thought that would be a really neat reflection of this area, is to have an art walk, an art kind of a place, and then have a wayfinding place to show where all the other trails are connecting, and a little place that's weather protected so you can get a little rest in the rain if it happens to be raining that day. But we thought this would make the service area a little more special, because this is a place that has all the manufacturing, light industrial kinds of things that we need as a city to be a full-service city, but it's not always the destination kind of place that some of the other places are. So we tried to figure out a way to make this, to use the special part of it to sort of amplify it in a different way. Question on service?
Just wondering, was there discussion again about the, calling this the service neighborhood? I'm just wondering if there was discussion about changing the name from service neighborhood.
Not that we heard.
Okay, to me, the word service and neighborhood don't seem to go together, and just a comment, I think that we could come up with a better name.
This one could remain in district.
Tricia, question about placemaking. In several of the visions, we talk about trails being placemaking, and I like the idea about having an art plan for trails, but that's not what I had envisioned urban placemaking would be about. I think about the trail that Redmond did through their downtown along the Sammamish River, and how off of the trail there are huge bump outs that have areas for workers to come out of office buildings and sit down and have lunch, and they're not all built by the public. And so it seems like a lot of the placemaking we talk about are those pieces in our control, but we don't seem to have placemaking required by private developers to provide those amenities, such as creekside areas. There's employers here, and so just even their own employees. I think there actually ought to be a very strong placemaking component in each vision that the developers understand is their piece of the placemaking puzzle, and that we're not doing all the placemaking for them, that they need to do it.
Other ideas for service? No? Old Route 10, iconic. This is the regional draw, locally historic, our original roadway going through. A lot of events already, a lot of festivities, huge right-of-way on Gilman Boulevard that we believe we should figure out some great uses for that huge right-of-way that we have there. That's part of the mobility strategy. And also, we're hoping to adopt a unique sign code that would allow them to keep those vintage Route 66 kinds of signs or something like that to fit with that character as things redevelop. Any questions for Old Route 10?
I am so thrilled to see you put Linear Park up there, because if this particular right-of-way is never going to be a new connection of any sort to the I-90 corridor or transit, it is so wide.
It's very, very, very wide.
2 lanes each direction and a really wide median, and it could be an excellent location for some sort of outdoor feature that is year-round.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge piece of land. So that's, I was so excited to see you added that in there.
Good, good. Any other thoughts on Old Route 10? Okay. Well, the next steps are Land and Shore is going to see this tomorrow night to follow up. We're going to let this all percolate tonight, and you'll give us some comments and more thoughts tomorrow. And then also on November 2nd, you get Land and Shore gets another review. Then Planning Policy, November 9th and 30th, they have their public hearings on those 2 nights. And then back to the Council and Land and Shore, and perhaps adoption in December. Questions about the schedule?
Or Land and Shores.
Some of them are before the agenda bill, though. Some of them are before it gets...
Trish, one of the things in general that alarmed me a little bit was many of the implementation strategies said we need to have a plan for this and a plan for that and a plan for this and a plan for that. And it looked like a lot of studies and a lot of plans, but we're supposed to come out of the moratorium. So if we don't have those plans, how do we come out of the moratorium and talk with a developer who wants to do something when we don't have those other plans and we don't know? It may be years before we have them done. What are we asking for? How do we deal with them if we come out of the moratorium?
Do you want to answer that?
It's not a rhetorical question.
You can answer it at Land and Shore tomorrow.
There you go. Yeah, it's tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
kind of a follow-on to that, and Keith, I would like to hear your answer to this as well, is this, as a moratorium item, this was originally district visioning, right? So we renamed these neighborhoods, visioning. So I'd like to hear in your own words, kind of what do you think this entailed? And because there was some comment or conversation already this evening. Keith, I think you said it yourself, and Trish, you said a couple times yourself, like, so how prescriptive does this get? Now, this is a visioning exercise. And so, but how far do you go? Right? How detailed? Do we talk about a specific amenity in a certain location between two property owners? What was your intent going, what was your understanding going into this as a visioning exercise on how far you went with that level of detail?
Super great question, and I don't know. I think the answer is we were successful if we don't get another situation where we are looking at the vision for a neighborhood and saying, that didn't turn out that way. And how come, right? And because I think that's what we heard on Western Gateway is, I think we sat and we looked at the vision, which said mixed use. We saw what got permitted, and there was no requirement for mixed use. I mean, the zoning allowed mixed use, but it was all residential, basically. And I think, as you read the vision and you saw what was getting built, I think it was not hard to say, I don't want to say we didn't hit the vision. I just think that the vision was probably so broadly written, it allowed for a lot of different outcomes, which then left us open to potentially, I think, maybe some criticism that, well, we're not following the plan. So I think for me, most of this exercise was how do we craft a brighter image of each neighborhood. Maybe, I'm not saying it has to be completely bright, but definitely brighter than it was, so that the community has a better sense for what to expect will happen there over the next 30 years. And, there's so much variability. There's market variability. There's property owner variability. There's so many things that can ultimately affect the outcome. But if we've done a better job in terms of describing what's important to that particular subpart of Central Issaquah, then I think we can actually go to bat for those things over the next decades and hopefully actually get them within each neighborhood. So the level of prescription, we're not talking about doing a development agreement for each neighborhood. We're not talking about writing specific prescriptive code like we did for vertical mixed use on every neighborhood. But I think what we'd like to find is that right balance point between a clear intention. So, for example, we talked earlier about East Lake Sammamish and the need to get across it safely as a pedestrian or a bicycle mid-block. And if we don't know any way on how we might achieve that, we might want to have some conversations about what that might look like so we can at least put maybe a little bit more teeth or description in the plan. So I don't know that there's an exact answer, council member, but I think that the goal is to get somewhere closer to the bullseye than we were previously.
And I think that's going to be very important for us to ever wrap up this work, is there has to be some agreement on what a complete exercise looks like, this district or neighborhood, visioning, how much detail. I think you just used a couple really important phrases about having very clear objectives, very clear goals, but are easy to, you used brightness or something like that, which is a little bit different. But at the same time, we could chase this for a long, long time. But I'm not sure we've ever been very clear on what constituted completing and meeting the objective for this item. When I think of visioning, and I'm not sure, how much detail that goes into, I'm not sure that we're all on the same page in that regard. And that might be something to revisit before we go a lot further. Because I think it should be kind of a whole council kind of understanding and agreement as well as what that what that distance, how far to go, is really what we're looking for here. I think that's very important. I have a couple other questions as well, and one kind of, because there's been a bit of conversation tonight about this as well. Tell us how the city can require a public amenity between two private landowners.
So depending on what that amenity is.
Or
so-
multiple,
Yeah.
not two.
So we could incorporate design guidelines that talk about kind of building orientation and the use of spaces between buildings. And so that's, so the city could codify kind of design guidelines, which would be probably more performance-based than prescriptive, because you're talking about so many different maybe ways that those things might get implemented. So, it might be along the lines of, two property owners, or when property owners build, there needs to be a certain kind of relationship between buildings that is positive to both, or that creates a positive space between the two. So there's not just a chain link fence or a big hedge between the two buildings. I don't know, but you could potentially add code language that would address that if you wanted to.
So in your understanding of this particular moratorium item, is that in scope?
I don't think, it would not be part of the vision piece, I don't think. You could write an overall vision statement on the first page, which is the Central Issaquah main district, that talks about context and compatibility between adjacent parcels. There already is something in the Architecture and Urban Design Manual draft that I think talks about context, and where when you come in with your building, you need to actually acknowledge the orientation of the adjacent parcel so that we don't end up with backs next to fronts. But, so this could be something that if the council and/or planning commission felt like we needed some additional leverage on this front, what I would suggest is on that first page, before we get into each individual neighborhood and talk about Central Issaquah, that there could be some language added which would then give the planners the ability to talk to property owners and applicants and say, okay, look, here's this guidance that's provided in our plan. And this plan, just to give everybody out here some context, this plan is part of the city's comprehensive plan. So the policies that are in it are actually things that we can use in our land use evaluation planning of applications. So I went way far afield, so.
Well, yeah, but you're getting to what I'm kind of looking for, because I think there's a sense that it's one thing to have a vision, and we had them before, and okay, now we've reworded them and added, and thanks for the bold words that highlight, what's added or different in this version of them. But at a certain level, this does feel like we really have, we may have some more clarity on the vision, but it doesn't feel to me like we've actually moved the needle toward, and now we're much more likely to actually achieve the vision. It may be more clarity, but I'm not sure we're there yet. But you just started describing, I think, some of the other elements that can be added to move us more in that direction. I just really wanted to plant that seed tonight,
Sure.
Because I know we're going to have a couple more touches and all of that, and I'm not sure there's a lot of runway in that time frame. But that was my one thing I wanted to get across to you. And my last comment or question is, what this exercise also did was, especially when it talked about the one neighborhood. No, the name just popped out of my head. Sorry about that. That across from Lake Sammamish State Park, Sammamish Park. So that now it talks about residential, and we've had it zoned, and now it's zone possible. But now there is some amenities near, kind of, across the street, across 17th over in that area. But it really did really highlight for me, we just think about what's happened recently right around us right here. Right over here recently, a market closed down, a food market closed down. And people who used to walk now drive to get all of their food. And because there's no grocery store or food market that's in walkable distance or a way for them to get there. Every single place that we're talking about and maybe want to encourage some residential where there isn't today, unlike kind of, the interesting thing about Atlas is nobody has to drive to Safeway. And so that type of impact is, you can see that it's not going to be the same as opposed to maybe someone in the Sammamish area where, or even that's out in Gateway right now, someone needs to go get groceries, everybody's driving. So I'm concerned, it just at a very high level, we have all these capabilities for residential. And we, I kind of asked about, how do we get the amenities, whether they be public or private, that we think a neighborhood needs? And if we're really going to achieve that kind of walkability and minimize the number of, especially single-person car trips, I just think we're setting ourselves up for something that could happen, but the actual achieving the lower transportation system impacts, I think there's a very high risk that we won't. Just like the Old Town neighborhood right now, it's a car trip to go get their groceries where it didn't used to be. So again, I'm not looking for an answer from you right now, but I think this just really points out, if we're really going to build out the infrastructure, they're really going to be walkable, the amenities are going to be close by. Have we really captured how we're going to achieve that? Because we cannot control whether or not someone brings a market in somewhere or not.
Right.
It's a great vision, but boy, there's still an opportunity to miss on some of the other goals, such as like the walkability and actually having people walk. Thank you.
Well, so I'd be looking for answers, because we have had public conversations about next steps that we need to take. The moratorium was not the be-all, end-all. The moratorium was the things that popped out as the critical concerns, and that as we reworked some elements of the Central Issaquah plan, we were going to need to take additional steps to perhaps codify what we wanted to get, and this is a perfect example. And I think you've heard lots of questions tonight about what the new proposed language is and how we're actually going to get that. And I think another pass through the visioning could create a list of the things that we definitely want, and out of that is the list of definite next steps that we need to take to make sure that we are going to get what we envision, not again just what we allow. And so I would be looking for fairly immediately a list of the actions that we need to take to codify in some way what we want out of the visioning, to turn it not just to it's a vision that is actionable, not just an aspired, this would be cool if it looks like that. Well, how are we going to get it? And, if there are, and to Paul's point about Sammamish Park, I don't know that, we are a suburban area. And I don't know that we're going to get everybody out of their car to be able to walk to a grocery store. But there are ways for people to get to grocery stores when they don't have to be in their car. We talked about it, the crossing, and riding bicycles and connections, sidewalk connections. So I think there are ways that we can get what we want, but I am nervous that we are going to lift the moratorium and then it's going to take us another 2, 3, 4 years or maybe another moratorium for us to take additional steps. I don't want to find us in the same spot. So I think several of us are saying the same thing. But I just wanted to say I am looking for answers about what we're going to do next. Mary Lou?
Save the easiest question for last. There is a couple of little brief comments about, we sure haven't gotten that regional traffic thing figured out yet. And I remember having a conversation with you a year and a half ago about the public sentiment about us not having that figured out, but deciding it's okay to add 600 apartments here, 450 there, 300 there, 200 there. I know they're not tied together, but just saying we'll figure it out someday is really, that's just not good enough. We can't say we love our vision, we love our central Issaquah, traffic sucks, and we're going to make it worse. So I know it's not part of the moratorium, but it's going to be really hard for me to move on to a vision when I know we can't execute on the vision because the roads are all plugged. So what? So we build more apartments and we still give ourselves another decade to figure out traffic. So while it's not in here, I need some degree of comfort that we're just not going to add to the volumes we already have when people can't move around at certain times of day now anyway. So I don't know how those pieces fit together, but just as a person who might be watching today and thinking, oh, great, they're going to release this in January and there's a capacity. We built 2,000 apartments in the last 3 years. We'll build another 2,000 more. How do they get around? Because they're not getting out of their cars because we don't have the bike paths done. We don't have the overcrossings done. So that is outside of this scope, but extremely concerning. And I didn't really see anything that made me get very excited about the visions. It just felt like too aspirational, and it's just, I don't know.
Raya?
I just wanted to sort of, I guess, add on a little bit to what I had heard about just to have the intent, not only the intent, but when we're looking at the visioning, to just have it be more specific and have more teeth, I guess, in terms of some of the things that we would like to see. And so even more clearly spelling out the intent, I think would be helpful, but maybe we could go a step beyond.
And just to add, think always of the implementation side for me. It's hard to take a vision and implement it unless you really have some clear steps along the way. And what makes it even more difficult is, like you say, you have someone comes in now, and how is that going to fit with the person who's going to come in 3 years later, right? Because they're going to come in one at a time. And so a vision of a whole thing is hard to do one Lego at a time, right? So that's my concern, that implementation that is clear enough that we know how to do it one piece at a time and make the next piece, which we don't know what it is, fit.
Other comments or questions? Okay, next stop tomorrow, Land and
Tomorrow, tune in.
We'll have a whole new version tomorrow, is that right?
Yeah, we're going to do that.
We're just kidding. Thank you. All right, next on our agenda, Forterra report. It's a growth perception survey, and we are pleased tonight to have with us Jean Duvernoy from Forterra and Ian Stewart from EMC Research, and they will present the findings of a regional effort to better understand how residents feel about growth in their cities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
I want me up there.
You do.
Yeah. I was thinking on the drive over here and talking to my friend and colleague Michael Beneke. Forterra, under various names, we started as the Seattle King County Land Trust, but we've been working with the city of Issaquah now for 30 years. That is a long time. We first started working with you on solidifying and assembling the Issaquah Alps, and then we've worked with you on a variety of land conservation projects since then, and different ways to look at how we build really robust communities. So thank you for that. It's a good partnership, and I will tell you that Issaquah, in the world we live in, Issaquah is really looked at as a city that is really striving to get it right. And that's probably what we're going to talk about tonight. How do we get it right? So let me remind us all who Forterra is, and then I'll provide a little context for the hard lifting, the heavy lifting that Ian will do on the survey and what we heard, and we'll open up for questions and answers. Is that all right? Great. So Forterra, you might have thought we were a conservation organization, right? That's not really what we're about. What we're about is really assembling and deploying those lands, we call them keystone lands, those lands on which we can hang this region's long-term success. Its long-term environmental success, and it's long-term, if you will, community success, and it's long-term economic success. So what are those most critical lands? Well, a lot of them are places like the Issaquah Alps and all. But there's also lands in our cities. Lands in our cities to make sure we have housing for everyone. Lands in our cities to make sure we have great community centers and other facilities. And what we've come to learn, I mean, you probably already know this, is that cities are just the most sustainable way for us to live. It's the way we can aggregate the capital to take care of our, our human, very messy existence. It's the way we don't disturb the ecosystem services in the rest of our countryside. Cities are the most environmental way we can live. And if you look at a lot of the research being done now, the future is going to be owned by metropolitan areas that really build great cities and then conserve the rest of the landscape so it functions for recreation, environment, timber flow, and food flow. But regions that get it right, those are the regions that are going to win the race to the top. And you can look at research by the Brookings Institute and a lot of geographic economists. It is those regions that get that matrix right that are going to win, that are going to be the most successful economically and environmentally in the years ahead. So the good news in all that is that the environmental concerns we all have and the economic concerns that we all have, and we want our kids to have jobs, it's the same solution set. It's build great cities and really protect the rest of the landscape. So let's talk about cities and how we do that. And that's where Issaquah is really a leader. And Forterra and many of us look at how you're doing it here. We've done a lot of research over the years, Forterra. We've done a lot of polling to really try to understand what's going on in our region. And let me give you a few points before we get into the most recent polling. A few points we learned. First, this won't surprise you, any of you, because you're all elected. Our citizens love their communities. In fact, if you look across the country, our citizens have a greater affection for their communities, where they live, their neighborhoods, than almost anywhere else in the country. Secondly, and this is to me an astounding fact, our public, and I don't care where you live in the Pacific Northwest, whether it's Algona, Issaquah, or Shelton, our public loves the outdoor and their environment greater than anywhere else in the country. And I don't care what your economic level is, what your background is, we have this deep reverence for our countryside. So that's interesting. Think about that. Our citizens love the outdoors and they love where they live. So as we build our cities, you can see why we have these rancorous meetings and all, because folks are so concerned about their own neighborhoods. Here's the other thing we learned, which gave me great hope. Because if we're really going to win this race to the top and we're really going to be environmentally sustainable, you need to have great cities, compact, livable, and conserve the rest of the landscape. And our citizens are with us. Our citizens, by a very significant majority, get it. They get that we need to really build in our cities and conserve the rest of our landscape. But there's a caveat to that. They get it with reservations. They want us to do it right. They want us to build right. Remember, they love their neighborhoods. They want us to know how we build those cities so that they're points of pride. So we were reporting some of this research over the years, and we reported to some of you all. And Fred Butler, Mayor Butler, kicked us off stage about a year ago when we went on too long about it, so we'll be brief tonight. And I think I was talking to Paul, Councilmember Winterstein, afterwards. He said, okay, well, what does it mean to get it right? And we didn't have the greatest answers, so we worked with Bob Harrison and Paul, and we worked with Redmond and Kirkland to say, we need to really delve into that. Because if we are going to be a region that wins that race to the top, great cities, great landscape, we need to know how to get it right, how to build our cities. That means we need to ask our citizens. Makes sense. Let's ask the folks who have to live here. So working with Ian at EMC Research, we put together a very interesting polling instrument and really dive deep into what our citizens were thinking. And that's what we want to report to you tonight. So one thing that I've seen consistently through it, before I'll say this and I'll let Paul get into the real detail. And I think I heard a little bit earlier from some of what you were saying is, our citizens want to understand we have a common vision for this region and our cities, how we're growing. That doesn't mean a 600-page plan. It means that the business community, NGOs like Forterra, civic leadership, and their elected leadership have a common sense of values in what we're trying to do with this region. And I think you'll hear some of that in this report from us, from Ian, is that they want to understand what, they want to see their core values reflected in what we're doing here. And I think we can suss some of those out from what we hear from Paul tonight. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. It's all about how we get it right, how we build a region that wins the race to the top, so our kids and our grandkids have a great economy, and we have conserved the landscape that give us a very great environment. And I will pledge that, at least as long as I'm at Forterra, we want to continue to be your partner in all this, so that the city of Issaquah and the Pacific Northwest can be the best it can be. So that's the way I want to start this off. We'll have We'll have Ian present his findings, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. Is that good? Well, thank you. And Ian?
Good evening. My name is Ian Stewart. I'm principal with EMC Research. Already introduced with a few minutes ago, but our firm does a variety of kinds of research, and the research we're doing tonight, as we were just discussing, covers a bunch of attitudes about growth, and I'm also happy to take questions as we go along if you see something that's confusing. We reserve some time at the end as well to cover those questions. Just going to make it full screen. Give me just a second here. Okay. So the overarching goal of this project was to give decision makers, you and everyone else that participated in the project, a better understanding of how residents feel about growth, the kind of the principles around growth. We spent a lot of time in this research looking at that and giving them some ways to give us feedback on how they want future growth, what they want it to look like, what those values are that are shared there. To get there, we did two things. One, we did some focus groups, a set of 4, which I'll describe in a few minutes, all of them on the east side, and mostly on perceptions of growth and change and how things are evolving on the east side. And then the second phase was a telephone survey to see, is what we heard in those focus groups reflected anywhere else but in that room? Because whenever you do a focus group, you always have to say to yourself, it's 12 people in a room, maybe they're not normal, right? You always got to wonder that. And so we did the phone survey to figure out if, in fact, what they said was reflected. The focus groups, I want to give you a couple of highlights there, and if you're interested, we have more. I was there for all of the hours of them, usually 2 hours per, so 8 hours roughly, all total. The first 2 groups we did among Issaquah and Sammamish residents, one of newer residents and one of longer-term residents. We defined that as essentially more than 5 years was the longer-term split. And what we thought here was that by splitting it this way, we would see what residents who essentially just arrived in sort of the long run feel about these questions and what longer-term residents feel about it. Because you can know from being in contact with your citizenry, they're going to have different attitudes about that. We thought that was a nice dividing line. We did the same thing in Kirkland and Redmond, one newer and one longer term. There was a slightly different attitudinal difference. The Issaquah Sammamish residents, in terms of welcoming growth, were a little bit more welcoming, and the Kirkland Redmond residents were a little bit more anti-growth, and we did that on purpose as well, because we wanted to see if there was any difference in those attitudes as well. And the progression of the group is there in general at the bottom. Whenever you're doing a focus group, you're trying to do some general attitudes, and you move into the specifics. We gave them some words to play around with, and we also solicited their own thoughts and words, and then we used that to form the telephone survey later. So some of the highlights of what we learned from the focus groups. One of the things we learned, and this is true nowhere else to the same degree as it is in Issaquah, that residents are seeing their communities changing really rapidly. Now, you know that. This manifests itself in the way they deal with traffic and growth every day, traffic, overburdened schools, construction, loss of open space. They see it sort of all over the place, and Issaquah is a really good example of that. When they see all that, then their knee-jerk reaction is to stop things and slow it down. You've experienced that directly here in town. I've lived here 40 years, and so looking at that quote there from one of our respondents, this was obviously the longer-term resident group in Issaquah, saying what I would say if I came into this room and say, I remember what it looked like 20 years ago when there were like goats running around in Issaquah, right? It doesn't look like that anymore. And when you have change like that over the long term, it changes your attitudes. So as we started to dig in this deeper, residents don't really think their cities to blame for this. They don't say, oh, it's the city leaders that have done this, but at the same time, they don't really know what cities are doing when it comes to managing growth. They don't really understand the relationships between the Growth Management Act, what you're doing here at city council meetings, what the planning board does. They kind of don't tune into that really. They don't really understand how that interplay happens. And so at the end of the day, it kind of feels like nobody's really in charge. When they look around, they say, this development's happening over here, but I don't really know how it got there or why. I really don't know if there's a plan behind it or if there's some reason why it's here. And so their reaction then, and this is the initial reaction, it gets different as you go on with this discussion, is that they want to see, they want to pause or stop because they want to see this as being managed and actually making some sense to them. Now, this doesn't mean there isn't a plan, right? We all know, sitting in this room right now, there is a plan, but it's all about perception, right? Their perception is there isn't one, and that may be more powerful than the actual plan itself when you think about what's going on in their minds. And we'll see that over and over again tonight. So one of the things we touched on was, what are the shared values that they want to see going forward for their cities? We heard this over and over again. Green space, preserving small town character, sort of the rural, the suburban stuff we talked about a few minutes ago, and then interacting with their neighbors. This was striking that we heard this a lot. I wasn't really expecting this to come out, but I'll highlight it a little bit later, but what that means. So when you first start to talk to people, they complain about growth a bit. They sort of say it's overgrown, there's too much traffic. And then you start to dive into this a little more, and then they say, well, actually, I know the growth's not stopping. And then you start to get real about it. They say, well, if growth's not stopping, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to have places that are walkable? That's what they were looking for. Maybe we should become more densely populated, because that means maybe we'll be able to walk around more. We won't have as much traffic. We'll get around a little easier. So as we think about this moving forward, communicating those values, the things that they think they want their city to have, and the elements that our planning already takes into account, that's the kind of stuff we're going to be emphasizing to them. I know you're already doing that, but when you think about the language you're using, you'll see in a few minutes that language needs to change a little bit. The other thing we found was that people are really willing to make trade-offs, so we kind of forced them into this. We said, all right, if we're going to take one thing, what thing would you take as a negative in exchange for that? We heard things like, I take density over this or that. I would take conservation of open spaces outside the city limits, natural spaces in the city. They're willing to trade things off for that. So they're willing to take higher buildings in favor of those things. That's one of the things we discussed in this group. You can see some of the quotes there at the bottom about some of the things they gave to us as part of that. So that brought us to the survey. We said, all right, are these people just 12 people in a room and their opinions aren't really reflective of anybody else? We wanted to go out and actually test it statistically. So what you're looking at is the methodology we conducted this phone survey with. The 19th to the 28th of June, so it's getting a little long in the tooth right now, but this kind of attitude, when you think about it, how long you've been going through growth issues in Issaquah, this is obviously not going to age that much, right? Things that happened in June, still pretty relevant today. We did a total of 600 interviews. The total margin of error for the whole region is 5.7 percentage points, but really what you're interested in is the breakdown by cities. So what we did was we did Redmond, Kirkland, and Issaquah each got an equal number of interviews, even though by population size, those are not the same populations, right? But we want to make sure that each one had enough to look at on its own. And then we put 4 other cities, and I'm using that term loosely because we kind of had to draw a big boundary around Duval, Carnation, North Bend, and Snoqualmie, put them into the other city category. The idea here was when you look at it, you think about Redmond, where they are in their growth pattern, Kirkland, Issaquah, and then these other 4 cities, they're all in different places, right? So Redmond, in my opinion, this may not be shared, sort of the furthest along on looking like a kind of a densified downtown, sort of a pattern of growth. Kirkland's sort of halfway there, right? They're in the middle of development, and Issaquah is sort of right at the beginning of that, heading towards the same destination, whereas Duval, Carnation, and North Bend, and Snoqualmie, right, they're in very different places in terms of the spectrum here. So this should give us a good sense of when we solicit opinions from these places, what it feels like to be across the east side. We do include comparative data in here. We really are focusing this on Issaquah's data, so you'll see that. I've called that out here. Here's a good first example. So if you look in the lower left corner, you'll see the question that we asked. If you can't read that, I'm happy to read it out to you. Is it visible from back there? I'm not really sure if it is. Yes? No? Yes? Okay. So this question is a right direction, wrong track question. It's a very standard warm-up question we ask kind of all the time in our surveys when we can. And really, it's a grouping of all those things together in the city that they feel like they want to have an opinion about. Is it the economy? Is it traffic concerns, education? All those other items go into right direction, wrong track. In Issaquah, and in fact, every city we tested, the right direction, wrong track number is pretty good. 62% here in Issaquah, right direction, 25% wrong track. Generally, what they're saying is, I'm pretty happy living here. I think things are going in the right place. We're heading in the right direction. If you look at this in the city of Seattle, it's actually underwater. It's the reverse of this. Seattle's like 45% wrong track, 43% right direction. So to give you a sense of what it feels like to live in cities in the Puget Sound, very different here in Issaquah than the feel it is in Seattle. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is the demographics we're able to do. I've picked out two that I think are the most important. We've used this in all the presentations we've done. So the shorter-term residents, in this instance, because we have a different population, we were able to get those that have lived here less than 15 years and those that more than 15 years. We found that that was the best cleavage we could use to look at that. And then geographically, the 5th legislative district and the 41st legislative district, that's another way to look at this. Look at town and sort of split it in a way that might be familiar to you. These two will go throughout here, but by bringing this up, I'm showing you that shorter-term residents have a very different attitude about the direction of this town than longer-term residents, right? You're going to see this happen over and over again. We're looking at the different demographic groups, specifically the resident one. You can see it reflected a little bit in the geography, but that's probably a function of short and long-term residents as well. So the next question we asked, we're still getting people warmed up. What do you think is the most important problem facing your city today? What you should notice, if you can do quick math, you'll notice that traffic congestion, growth, expansion, development in Issaquah are far and away much larger than anywhere else, right? You take those two together, 70% of all mentions. In an open-ended question like this, we don't give them an answer. They tell us what they think. So they give us a sentence, they give us a couple of words here and there, and then we put them back in these categories. There's no other city that comes close, right? 70% of those mentions, traffic congestion, growth, expansion, development. We saw this when we were going through the results. We said, all right, something different is going on in Issaquah than the rest of these cities. You can clearly see that growth and expansion is a concern in that group of the 4 other cities at almost 50%, but then traffic drops off quite a bit. When you look in Redmond and Kirkland, right, it's there at like 20-something%, but it's not. It's almost double that in traffic congestion in one place, and not quite double growth and expansion. So clearly, Issaquah feels different than these other cities that we're talking about when we're comparing these. Whenever we look at about a 10-point open-ended response, we think that's significant. So the fact that growth, expansion, and development is 3 times that, and traffic congestion 4 times that, it really does tell you, this should not escape any of you that that's what the big problem is in town. But the magnitude of it just feels very different. Yes?
So was the answer to the question that they could only pick one?
In this survey, we usually take the first response and we just move on. They may have more to say, but because we have a limited amount of time, we don't solicit a second one in this. We do that sometimes when we have more time. We'll solicit second and third responses.
Just to understand it then, since we seem to have a lot of issues in town, it means that only for housing affordability, only 5% listed as number 1.
That's right.
It doesn't mean only 5% are concerned.
That's right.
Because they might have listed it as 2 or 3. But we don't have that. We just have what, if you can only name 1, what's your 1?
That's right.
Okay, thanks.
So despite all the complaining that I mentioned to you earlier, despite seeing the traffic congestion, despite seeing this one with traffic congestion, growth, and expansion, you might expect that after I ask that question, I would ask a question about quality of life. This is actually a scale of excellent, good, only, fair, or poor. The better ratings are the dark blue and the light blue, and then the weaker ratings are the pink and the red. You'd expect this to not be so good, right? But it's excellent. It's off the charts excellent. And this is something we've found sort of across the east side. Yes, I complain about traffic. Yes, I complain about growth. But man, this is a great place to live. I like living here. The excellent, 45%. The other cities fared even slightly better, 53% excellent. And the vast majority of everyone else there in the good rating. So despite everything you're about to hear coming next, people still at the end of the day say this is a great place to live and I like my quality of life here. I think you should really keep that in mind, because we can make and what you're really seeing, as Gene said, what you're seeing next is a reaction to, I want to keep it this way. I want to keep my quality of life excellent or good. So the next scale, we're really trying to get our hands around how do people think about this? What are they thinking about growth generally? We've asked this on a 3-point scale. So one would be, and there's 2 questions here. There's one for Puget Sound and one for your city alone. Do you think things in the Puget Sound region are growing too fast, too slow, or about right? I'm not really sure who's going to say too slow, but a small percentage did. And then we say the same thing for your city. And the idea here is to compare, if we know that Puget Sound is growing so rapidly, in fact, among those rapidly growing regions in the country, how do you feel your place is growing compared to that overall? So in Redmond, Kirkland, and the other cities, you'll see that their perception of their own cities are actually growing not as fast as what's happening in Puget Sound as a whole, but in Issaquah, it's even. So if there is growth overheated anywhere, it's happening right here. Because you can see 61% say that both Puget Sound region and Issaquah are both growing too fast, whereas a majority in Kirkland feel like they're not growing, they're growing at about the right pace, whereas Puget Sound is growing at 60% too fast. You see how that breaks down? So you can see how Issaquah, once again, stands out as a little different. In the other cities, you can see a really good sort of dichotomy there of the other cities saying, we're growing too fast, but really Puget Sound is growing even faster than we are. I'm trying to give you yet again a sense of what's going on there. So pulling out these subgroups again, this doesn't tell us quite as much as some of the other ones, right? But it does give us a little bit of indication. So the shorter-term residents are less likely to think that Issaquah is growing too fast, whereas the longer-term residents are more likely to think that Issaquah is growing too fast. But they're also both shorter-term residents likely to think that the Puget Sound region is not growing as fast, right? So you can see the split there between the shorter and the long-term residents. So the next question, we did a forced choice. We really like forced choices because it allows us to frame something and then force people to pick an answer that we've defined for them. We've chosen two statements here. Statement A, my city has a clear plan for how to grow and accommodate more residents. Statement B, my city doesn't seem to have a plan for growth. Now again, I reminded you about perceptions a few minutes ago, okay? So no matter what you actually think your plan might be, we asked them, do you think there's a plan? Issaquah, 40% said the city has a plan, 49% said the city has no plan. I guarantee you there is in fact a plan. We know that, right? I've been in these meetings where you've discussed it, but their perception is that there isn't one. And this is borne out by what they see every day and not understanding the connections between what's happening on the ground, what the actual plan might be, okay? So we know that this is happening across the region. You see that here in Redmond is the best at this, right? And 51% still say the city has a plan and 42% say the city has no plan, right? So even in the one that seems like it might be the furthest along, there's still not really a perception that the plan exists among, 40% of residents. Looking at that same question now by these groups that we've done a few minutes ago, shorter-term residents more likely to think the city has a plan, and then the longer-term residents less likely to think that. This flipped around when we looked at the other regions. You looked at Redmond, the longer-term residents are actually more likely to say that they had a plan. And I think part of this, we won't be able to get into too much of this tonight. I feel like there's something about getting further along in that growth plan that actually the longer-term residents can reflect on it and say, oh, wait a minute, this actually turned out okay, right? So that's one of my messages tonight is that when you're in the middle of this, it feels really difficult, but when you get through to the other side, things start to change quite quickly. Mercer Island's a really good example of that, which I can go into later if we're interested. Another forced choice here, the A statement, I feel like growth in my city is being fueled primarily by a strong economy and people moving here for opportunities. The B choice is, I feel like the growth of my city is being fueled primarily by developers. So we did this on purpose. We wanted to see here if we're making a forced choice, which really does carry with it a value statement, right? Is it things are the economy is sort of naturally going along here, or is somebody else coming in and taking our spaces and sort of fueling this growth? In Issaquah and the other cities, this is much more conflicted than it is in Redmond and Kirkland. It really gives you a sense of, when I said overheated a few minutes ago, this gives you a sense of what that feels like, right? And when I'm turning around, I'm saying it's the developers that are bringing this. It's not even the economy anymore that I'm worried about. I feel like something else is driving this for a good proportion of people. Whereas in the other two cities, Redmond and Kirkland, you can see it's actually almost 70% now saying the economy is what's driving this. So we asked another forced choice here. The A statement was new people moving here are driving their cars and that's making congestion worse. The B statement is new people moving here are not driving cars and getting around in ways other than driving. We did this simply to show you that people tend to project their own behavior on others. So despite what you may think about apartments downtown where the car, we know the car average is dropping to 1 or even less. People are using car sharing programs, and those aren't adding nearly as much to traffic as you might think. People don't actually know that. They don't make that connection. What they look at is they say, this new apartment building's coming to town, all these people are driving cars and it's going to make traffic worse, and they complain about that. We heard that in the group over and over again. People are like, all these new developments, they're going to have all their cars, they're going to make traffic worse, what are we doing? Well, this is why, because they're projecting themselves and their own behavior onto what's happening there. It's interesting to remind us of that. We think about what people's reactions are.
A question about that slide?
Sure.
So traffic volumes are actually rising, though. So we are building multifamily, and year over year, our traffic counts are going up. So where's the disconnect between their perception?
So what I'm linking this to is the reaction we heard in the focus group of people negatively looking at these apartment complexes, particularly in Issaquah, when they're saying, look at that apartment complex. That thing is going to drive traffic through the roof. But we know that when you're building these, you're building them with either one space or even less per car. And a lot more of those people are on transit than what you would get from a single-family home. So what I'm saying to you is that they're looking at a single-family home and saying, oh, there's 2 cars in that one. They're projecting the same thing to the apartment complex and saying there's 2 cars in every single one of those units.
So that makes sense, but we could have built maybe 6 single-family homes where we built 350 apartments. So the math still doesn't work out. The traffic volumes are going up. And so if you build an apartment building instead of single-family homes, the traffic volume's going up, whether some of them take the bus or not. So how does it sounds like you're saying it's a projection and not reality, but the actual numbers are going up, because even in our traffic models, it'll say this apartment building will add 350 trips per day. So they are driving.
Okay. I mean, what I've heard in every other presentation we've talked about, when I bring this slide up, they say the same thing to me. They say, yes, we're building these, and we're actually building them to where people aren't going to be driving as much as what we have in a single-family home.
Okay,
And
so it's more of a perception, it's not data, because the data is actually showing us they're using their cars and they're
Yeah,
adding to the
I'm
traffic.
not
Okay,
bringing you
it's
trip data here,
perception.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So the next section, what we tried to do was to give some statements on principles that might guide growth management and get their feedback on them. So this first list, you can read them, and I'm going to put them together in a couple of different groups for you to absorb. What we try to do here is, from a bunch of different perspectives on growth management, what are the principles that should be guiding us as we go to the future? And this is the first page when you look at these. There's a couple of those that I'll pull out in a minute, but you can get a sense of where we're going as you read through them. The second page is here, and what we've tried to do is to use different language in different places to get a sense of how people feel about these principles and what their attitudes are towards them. So when I take all those, we can certainly come back to these because I realize I haven't given you a ton of time to read them, but I am going to group them together in a few minutes. So if you look at these all together, and I realize you didn't have time to read a bunch of them, but we've done this on an agree-disagree scale. The dark blue is a strongly agree, the light blue is a somewhat agree, and then the disagree is there in the pink and the red. We've also totaled the agreement and the disagreement, so you can see the blue column there, the total agree, the pink reddish column, the total disagree, and the net agreement, that's essentially how big is the agreement over the disagreement in each of these. Our city should be welcoming to all people. We should have access to green space inside the city. You can see those two sort of stand apart from the others in terms of their intensity overall, right? That strongly agree, the most intense side of the scale, 75, 78%. The next grouping is there roughly in the 50s. You can see that urban development, open spaces, new development and transit centers, people welcoming to people of all incomes, right in the 50s in terms of strongly agree. As you start to move down the list, you can see that the intensity is starting to drop off quite a bit, right? And you see the disagreement starting to rise. A couple of these, as I said, we'll get into a few more. That change zoning to prevent sprawl is actually a flipped question. So we actually asked it, the disagree is what we expected to have there. So that's why it's coming up so high. But we'll look at that again in a minute. But this gives you a sense of the overall. If we want to come back to any of these, we can. But I want to spend some time with each of the individual ones, particularly this one. This next section, these next couple slides, I think are the most valuable in the entire presentation. So what we tried to do here was to look at 4 principles around growth management and growth generally, and we used different languages. The highlighting is mine, so they didn't actually hear bolded on the phone with people. But the first principle that we read, I want to read it to you specifically and have you absorb these words. We need to protect the rural farms, forests, and wild spaces outside the city boundaries. We should prohibit any new development in these open spaces. So I want you to think about that statement for just a minute. The second one here, more people are coming. We should protect the forest, rural farms, and wild spaces outside of our city boundaries by encouraging more compact development and higher buildings in the city center to prevent sprawl. I've highlighted 2 phrases there, compact development and preventing sprawl. The third one, if we build considerably taller buildings, and we haven't defined that, in the city center, we will be able to limit development elsewhere in the city and preserve our single-family neighborhoods, so slightly different language in that third one. And the last one, many of the neighborhoods in this city are zoned for single-family housing, which limits the amount of space available to build. We should change the zoning laws to allow more apartments, condos, and townhomes to be built in these neighborhoods so we can prevent sprawl outside the city limits. 4, go ahead.
Just a question on the fourth one. So sort of in the Issaquah planning for growth, we talk about designating areas for more density that currently aren't single-family neighborhoods. So is this suggesting that we even should be looking at our single-family neighborhoods to take additional density too? Is that what that principle?
No. The purpose in putting this was, one, to have a totally different look at growth. It's also something that other cities have considered. So we wanted to test this just to go show you what the reaction would be. I'm not proposing this as some solution. I'm just saying we wanted to give you a sense of, because if all these, everyone agreed with all of them, and we come back to you with, well, everyone's agreeing with everything, right? So we wanted to make sure to show you that there was, in fact, one that people didn't agree with. So if you take the 4 of those, and I can go back and forth because the language matters here for each of these, you can look at not only where everybody's reacting to, but where Issaquah falls in each of these. So that first one, I am going to flip back and forth a couple times. So that first one, we should prohibit any new development in these open spaces. In Issaquah, almost 3/4 are agreeing with that, and 20% disagreeing with that. You can see that agreement in Issaquah is among the highest of any of the 4 places that we tested. The only other place that it's higher is in the other cities, right? That group of Duval, Carnation, and the other ones. And so when you think about these values, that for the most part was the most broadly shared and the strongest shared value of any of the 4 that we tested. You move to the next one, compact development to prevent sprawl. I'll just remind you what that is again. You're protecting forests, rural farms by encouraging more compact development and higher buildings in the city center to prevent sprawl. We talked about those trade-offs a few minutes ago. In Issaquah, this one gets a 64% agreeing with that and 31% disagreeing. Still a big net agreement here, right? We're still well above a majority. We move to the next one, though, you can see that we now have dropped off significantly to essentially even, right? And that one was, if we build considerably taller buildings at the city center, we will be able to limit development elsewhere in the city and preserve our single-family neighborhoods. There's a few things that are going on in here, and it depends on which city you're looking at to think about which language and what we're communicating about what we're trying to do is making sense to people and which ones they're on board with and which ones they're not, right? So you can see that when we use that language in Kirkland and Issaquah, you have a majority in Kirkland and 62% in Redmond, and that third language agreeing, but only right below a majority in Issaquah. So there's something that happened between Statement 2 and Statement 3 in Issaquah that didn't happen in the other two cities. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about what am I saying to people as I'm describing what we're going for as Issaquah, what our planning looks like, where are we going, and what are we trying to do. Which language you use matters because their reaction to it will be dependent on the language you're using. The last one, changing zoning to prevent sprawl, was essentially universally disagreed with everywhere, right? And the reason we put that on there was to simply show you that that was a different way you could get at the same values we talked about a few minutes ago. But in that construction, people are saying, nope, that's not what I want to do. I think these two slides, again, when you think about the language, you think about the language we used here, the terms of compact development, this is starting to give you the language of the ways you might be talking about what you're doing in a consistent way that is going to connect with people. So looking at those same questions now with the longer term and shorter term residents, you can see there's not much difference there on the first one, prohibiting development open spaces, but there definitely is on the compact development to prevent sprawl. You can see those shorter term residents, which generally tracks with younger, although not always, much more agreement with that one and much less for those longer term residents. Slightly smaller gap on that third one and a little bit of a gap. It's a little bit bigger on that fourth one. Really, it's that second one where you see the biggest change in the two of those. And those vary depending on which community you went to. In Redmond and Kirkland, they all had slightly different versions of this chart. Looking geographically, there's not as much to write home about here, right? There's not nearly as much agreement, which is interesting when you think about there were differences on some of the other slides, that those came back together here when we talk about geographically within the city. So a few more of these that I think are interesting, not quite as instructive as the other ones we just looked at, but they still are interesting. And then we'll close out for questions. So this next one we tested, which I showed you a minute ago. We're going to put the two of these together. So one was growth has been good. We've had more opportunities to experiences for me, my kids, more amenities and services. The next one was if we focus on mixed-use commercial development, we're going to attract more shops, restaurants, and services, more things for us to do in the city. So when you look at the agreement there, the second one actually had more agreement in Issaquah than the first one. And it's similar kinds of stuff, but it's not quite the same. So the second one is more of a forward-looking. The first one was more of a, today, what has it done for me? And I think that there's an ability to sort of imagine the future that allows people to say, yeah, I'm more on board with imagining the future of what it might look like to attract those things than I am with what's happened so far. So we're still looking at these. There is a gap there on the first one with the shorter and long-term residents, and the same gap at the bottom. It closes a fair bit when we get to the second one. So kind of explains to you what's going on there with the higher levels of agreement with statement number 2. So the next one, in order to make sure we can grow and still get around, we should expand public transit and focus new development around transit centers. So people have to use their cars. The other one, much of the development I see is poorly designed, and I want to see development that's well designed and fits the character of this city. So I bring the second one, and I want to actually focus on that one first. You'll notice that once again, Issaquah sort of stands out among everybody else. So my working theory here is that by the time that we get to Issaquah, we already know what we've seen in terms of attitudes about growth, feelings about what growth is like here. My sense is that when you feel like growth is that far out of control, what you're saying is that everything bugs me now, right? So even the design of the buildings bugs me to a degree that it doesn't in the other cities. It still bothers people in some of the other cities, but it's far more so in Issaquah than anywhere else. The other one, focusing development on transit centers, you can see that it's almost, we're getting 3/4 agreement everywhere, a little bit higher than that even in Issaquah. People are saying, yes, that's the way we should be moving forward. Once again, the residency question here, the well-designed question was far more agreement there among the shorter-term residents.
Sorry, I have a question. Sorry, that question around development well-designed, tell me again. I want to see development as well-designed, so that aspirational, sorry.
Yeah.
Not that development is well-designed.
No.
Yes, okay, that makes more sense.
I have a question for you on the slide that talks about the differences between long-term, short-term residents.
Yes.
So I think in the original part of the presentation, I think there were 600 total respondents and then broken out amongst the cities. We might be a little unique in that we have two very new neighborhoods, and by very new, I mean less than 20 years old, that sort of came master planned. Is it possible to tell how many new residents are in the master planned areas versus the rest of the city, like Squaw Mountain? And is that a breakdown we could get?
Probably. I'm hedging only because I'm not sure exactly how we do it and whether it lines up with the geographies that we have that we're able to access. Typically, we could get to the precinct level, so if you could do it that way, yeah. But the other caveat, which I thought you were going, the sample size on these are not huge, right? So when we're looking at these differences, to some degree, when we get to this level, it's a little tough to say, unless it's a really big gap, we can't really say it's a difference, right? So that's one of the challenges in doing any of this kind of stuff. You really have to see big gaps to say, yes, there's a difference.
Right.
Last couple, and I think we can pick up the pace to get to your questions. I feel like I've used most of my time, or maybe I haven't, and we can keep going. One was we should be welcoming all people, and I want people of all incomes to be able to make a home here. On those two, there was a lot of agreement, but not universal. So the question always comes up, but who doesn't agree with that? Well, 6% don't agree we should be welcoming all people, and 14% don't agree we should be welcoming to people of all incomes, which I think is interesting. It's out there as a statement, and now you can quantify it in the city of Issaquah and throughout the east side. I don't know how much of that is sort of an economic outlook about you can't actually afford to be here, right? So we can't be welcoming all people versus the attitude. We'd have to spend more time with them to do that. But we tested out just to give you a sense of the full range of questions about growth in the future. This next one, the question here was, I feel like I have a voice in how my city should grow now and in the future. So in this one, this was interesting. The other cities feel like they have an answer for you about why Issaquah had the highest agreement here. Their answer was, well, you enacted the moratorium, so you listened, so therefore they feel like they have a voice because you listened. That was their theory. I don't know if you actually ascribe to that or not, but that's what they told us about you. In the other cities, when we asked this question, really the intent here was to see. There's a second element of this which we didn't get a chance to ask, which is, do you even want a voice, right? Do you want to be part of this? And if you look at some of the other research that we do for other East Side cities, you'll often see that people don't really pay much attention to what you're doing at City Council. It may be work that you're interested in, but their level of understanding and how much they're paying attention to it may not rise to the level of you'd like it to, and this is part of a reflection of that, I think. Yes?
The question says, should your city follow? So does that mean that they think we're, like, if you asked me the question, if you can go to the other
Yeah, so this is the actual statement we read to them.
I feel like I have a voice in how my city grows now. And, so it had two pieces in it, because the question on the bottom on the next one.
No, we were just trying to summarize
Okay.
there. What we said was, do you agree or disagree with this, right?
Okay,
So
we didn't ask it as two questions.
No,
Do you feel you have a voice, or should you have a voice?
This is the intro to the whole section that you're seeing there. This is the actual statement we read them. We read that and it said, do you agree or disagree with that?
Okay.
So there's not a two-part there. This principle, we really could skip forward because access to green spaces inside the city boundaries is essentially universal. There's really not much to write home about here. Everyone wants to have access to green spaces inside the city boundaries. That's not a shock. I'm sort of bringing this back full circle again. This is a picture that we showed in the focus groups towards the end. We must have been about an hour and a half in at this point. And at this point, we've done a lot of talking. We asked for a lot of statements. We read them a lot of things. We asked them to pick from a variety of values that they thought made sense. That's where we heard the green space question. We heard the preserving stuff outside of the city. And we said, okay, well, of these four pictures, which do you want? Which of these cities do you feel like should be your future? 80, 85, 90% chose X when they saw it. And so we sort of try to dig into that. All right, what made you choose X? Why not W? Why not Y? Why not Z? And so when you look at X, there's a couple things that stand out to you. You've probably already noticed them.
Can you point out which one is X, just because
Sorry,
it's so
yes.
light?
The upper right here.
Top right,
Yeah,
thanks.
top right.
There's two of them. Two of them are X.
Yeah, there's two X's, right? Both of the one with the streetcar and the one with which looks like sort of a mixed-use apartment with some green space around it. That green space was what people noticed first. They said, well, you know what I like about X is that I can see there's clearly some green space, like I've been telling you for the last hour and a half that I want, right there next to me. The next thing they started to talk about was, well, I can actually see that there's a variety of ways I might live there. So I can see, looks like there might be some townhomes and maybe some condos and maybe some other things that are going on. I'm not really sure what's going on in the background. So it feels like I might live in a place that I have access to green spaces, but have a choice about how I might want to live. And the second thing they said was, all right, I asked them, what's that other picture? And they said, well, I assume it's right around the corner, and then I can walk to that, and it looks like there's some mixed-use development. There's transit there. There's clearly some interactions with neighbors. This is where they started to get into this idea of, well, and this came up here in Issaquah and in Redmond. Mostly what I have is W, and what happens is people go into their big homes, and they enter them, and I never see them again. And I have no idea who I live next to, and they're enjoying their big giant home, and there's no sense of community. And I would like to have some sense of community. In X, I feel like I would see the same people going from my building here to down the street to whatever the restaurant is or whatever the shop is, and I come back, and we run into each other all the time, and we'd have community. That shocked me. I did not expect that to come out, but that's what they said. And we said, well, we pushed a bit and said, well, what about why? That's, you talked about wanting green spaces, and there's some green there. No, not really. I mean, there's a couple trees, but I don't really feel like that's a green space in the same way that it is X. So why am I spending all this time on these pictures? The reason I am is because these pictures did more in 5 minutes than I did in an hour and a half of trying to get statements out of them, right? So one of the lessons here is when you're talking to the city council and you're using planning terms and you're talking about all these things, the pictures are so much more helpful. Because when you show these pictures and when you show the right pictures of green space, right? If I zoomed in, and this was, Redmond told us this, that they were showing this picture, but they zoomed in on the building, and the reaction when they showed the first picture was, I don't like that. It looks like it's just a giant building. Because you haven't shown the green space, right? Without the green space, this is not meshing with the values they're telling us they want. They want that green space to be there. And when they don't see it, their reaction is, well, you're just building bigger buildings, and I don't get it. So the picture is hugely important. The degree to which you can use the value statements I had earlier about what we're trying to do as a city and pair it with these kinds of things and show them this is where we're going. This is what our plan is all about. Here's what it looks like in the future. You'll have a lot better connection with them, a lot more understanding of what it is, or where it is we're trying to go. I summarized all that with this slide, but I feel like I told you it better than I could in this slide. I think we should stop here and take other questions that you might have, which may be a lot, a little, I don't know, but I'm happy to take them.
Do you have next steps for this? Do you have, okay. Well, it's a question I have too.
Okay, there you go.
You'd have to ask Gene and Forterra that, I think. I don't know what their next steps are, but at this point, all the cities have heard this presentation now, and I'm not sure if there is an answer I can give you.
You have to come up to the microphone, Gene. How we're
two
gonna-
things. We just hit you with.
You have to actually start talking when you get to the microphone.
There's two things, and we just actually hit you with enough data, and I've seen this how many times, and my head spins. But I look at this, and I think there's some overarching statements here that if I was looked at this and I was responsible for a city, I said I am committed to making a city that is going to welcome all people, that is going to strive to have its new development compact so it saves the region's open spaces. In the process, we're really going to make sure we have green space, and you can see from the pictures, adequate infrastructure to build these vibrant communities where there's a real sense of community. And that's what I got. I mean, you distill it all down, and it really comes to a couple principles. So what are our next steps? We would be delighted to spend a little more time with you and your planning staff and your professional staff to sort of unpack this and repack it if that's helpful to you. We have a number of ideas for our own selves about how we take this and do a little bit of visioning of what citizens want, about how we work with the development community and the regulatory community to take this and put it on the ground. So we have sort of a continuing work plan for ourselves in concert with our cities. And that's something we are just developing now and would love to spend more time with your team on.
Okay, thank you. Lou?
Great presentation. Actually, Jean, you might want to stay up there too, because my questions might be a little general. Actually, I didn't find the data overwhelming. I found it really informative. We've been living this experience for the last 5 years and are in communication with our residents, and I think you've actually captured the sentiment of what's out there. Some things that I wanted to talk about just in general about growth. Issaquah already had some existing community issues before we adopted our plan for the valley floor. Traffic, pass-through traffic. And some of the other cities involved, while they do have highways, they're typically not cities that people drive through to go somewhere else. So one of the things we hear in our community is that, a significant portion of our traffic doesn't live, shop, work here, stop, just goes through. It impacts the quality of life and livability here, and it's something we've struggled with since 1960, so we haven't quite figured it out. Yet, you are adopting plans that are not linked to dealing with that issue, meaning you are creating densification, new styles of neighborhoods on top of roads that couldn't carry the cars from 5 years ago. And I'm not sure, there were no questions that were asked about that, but it seems like this data presented a kind of a livability index. Do you like where you are? But it didn't really, it was Issaquah. Is there any piece of Issaquah situation that is different that we might want to actually extract some more information out from what you said? Because I think our problems might be a little different. That was the first question.
You want to talk about that?
It would have been nice to go deeper than that. With Issaquah, one of the challenges in fitting all this in was to find a shared set of what are we trying to learn from this across all of these cities plus the other cities, right? So we look at that, we said, all right, we need to know what growth feels like across all these cities, because in Redmond, the attitude was, you're right, we're not a pass-through city, as you described, but their question was, the process we've gone through and where we are now, what do people think of this? Or have we got a citizenry that thinks we've done a good job here, or do they think we've messed it up? So I think when you look at the broad spectrum, it's much harder to be able to ask specific questions to follow up what you're asking about in the survey.
Okay.
So I think that's part of the answer, which is I would love to, but we need another 10 minutes of survey time.
Yeah, and I think each city has its own particular subset of problems, right? And you're right about that. And the pass-through issue came up with some other cities when we had these sort of city manager focus groups. I remember it in Duval, and I do remember it in Redmond, talking about other cities, other traffics passing through Redmond. There was an interesting thought by many of the folks in that one focus group, elected officials and city managers, of saying, how do we start to build these sub-regional councils, if you will, to really talk about what is going on regionally and how we manage our cities accordingly. And that was and you may have been there, Paul, in one of those conversations, but a whole sense of let's start breaking our east side into subregions and how our cities coordinate within those subregions, look at the traffic, and then go talk with King County too.
Okay, and then the second question, kind of a high-level one, is that this density is coming about because of the Growth Management Act, which proposed a dual track of bringing jobs and housing to urban areas, and Issaquah happens to be an urban area. However, we've seen very modest jobs, and so we are still a car-centric community for the most part, not having light rail, but having some bus service. How does that compare to growth and density non-east side, meaning we are not, what happens if we just get all our housing and don't get any jobs and the transportation improvements lag a decade behind? How does that all tie? For example, Seattle, they've got higher zoning capacity. They're building more units, but they're also getting tons of jobs and we're not. So how does that feed into this picture of planning for growth when the growth you're getting is imbalanced? It's housing, not jobs.
Yeah, and I'm sure you have some thoughts, and I'm sure your thoughts, Councilmember Pauly, are far more, am I saying your name right?
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks. Far more nuanced than mine. A couple things. You had said that the Growth Management Act is giving you this burst of growth. The Growth Management, as we would all agree,
okay.
Yeah, the Growth Management Act sets up some framework, but the growth is being caused by just this hard-driving economy. And I think we always got to say to ourselves, we're pretty fortunate to have this problem. It's a good problem to have. I think jobs and housing is a bit out of whack. You were absolutely right. And if I was in the legislature or elsewhere, I'd really want to start talking about how we diversify some of that economic base so that we're not such a hub and spoke region.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. One of the other ones was when you're talking with, when we're in this study with 4 others or 3 other cities and then a group of smaller cities. Did you look at where we all are in our targets, meaning whether or not we're all at 100% housing and 20% jobs, or are we similar in our balance of our housing job ratios?
That's not something we use as part of the factor. I think there was far more about the interest in the cities wanting to know this data than it was about do the cities line up as the right should we have picked Renton instead, right? It was more about who was interested.
But this is some of the extra work we want to do now. You're spot on. We want to look at sort of level of building, a whole bunch of different on-the-ground data to see if we can correlate it to this attitudinal data. Job housing imbalance, can we see if that influences this data?
Or sad.
The rate of land conversion, that's the next step for this.
Okay.
Other questions? Lola?
What was and you may have said this, and I may have missed it, what was the spread on homeowners versus renters?
I don't think I did say it, actually.
Because I'm fascinated and frankly a little stunned that affordable housing pricing, housing availability is only 5%, substantially below Redmond or Kirkland as a concern. And I just wonder, that would be probably fairly well explained if it was mostly homeowners and didn't have a substantial dose of renters.
You should have been reflective. It was a random population, right?
Yeah, I'm cycling through to see. We almost bought me enough time to look at the questionnaire.
You want to come back?
Yeah, I think we need to come back to it. I don't think we asked it. Yeah, I don't think we asked that question.
Was there anything about the methodology of the survey that would have lent itself to homeowners rather than renters?
Yes, I mean, this is generally going to be an older population, so it is more likely to be homeowners.
Okay.
Other questions?
Though the newer residents, would that split towards renters?
But the way it was conducted would still be older, so.
Oh, all right, okay.
I just want to comment, make a follow-up on Tola's, because Tola, that question, and Ian did talk about this a little bit, they may have, it was an open-ended question, and they may have actually mentioned multiple things, but this was the first, that data captured their first concern. I think, isn't that what you said earlier? So it's not, I looked at that and I think it doesn't say that they're not concerned. It's just only 1 out of 20 think it's the top concern.
Yeah, Councilmember Pauly mentioned that too, that they, remember you said we had to just choose one, and there may be a lot of second level concern, particularly for homeowners, right? So that might not be your primary concern, but it is a strong secondary, and that's not really going to be sussed out in this data.
The reason that I bring it up is that when you look beyond the east side of King County, you start seeing housing burden rates that are just skyrocketing. In fact, I went back and I double checked when you did this to make sure that it was the middle of, that it was this summer, which it was. But I was recently in Ellensburg, and 60% of their population is housing burdened. Right. So this is it. I get that this is just what is your single biggest, or what is the biggest issue, but it's still, the fact that we're noticeably below Redmond and Kirkland is interesting.
So maybe this is one good point that will help you put this in context. The same rough population, if you asked in the city of Seattle this question, the question of affordable housing and housing affordability would be off the charts. It'd be like 30, 40% of the concern. Housing and homelessness are the two biggest concerns in Seattle right now. So that gives you a perspective on why this might be different. And part of what we say is that when you're comfortable in where you're living, when all things are equal, you worry about traffic and you worry about growth. And when things are tougher, you're like, well, now I'm worried about homelessness. I'm worried about whether I can afford my house. So very different picture in Seattle.
So I think it was Councilmember Pauly asked for next steps. Let me suggest two other ones. We're going to go back and look at that really hard at that 5% number for your affordable housing concern vis-a-vis the others, and see if we can suss out, at least at that data and what else we know, whether there's something else driving it. So we'll get back to you on that. The other thing we're doing, and I'd like to hear from the council if there's any ideas. We're again going to go to sort of on-the-ground hard statistics, hard facts, like job versus housing split, number of building permits, and other measures we can take to see how that might have influenced some of this response between the three cities. So if there's any kind of independent variables you guys want us to look into, we would like to hear it. and see if they correlate to any of the attitudinal information we picked up here. Looks like Paul has a question.
When we first started this, the last year or so, and I think you may have, one of you said something at the beginning, and I forget who made that. It's one thing to get some data, to understand the attitudes and the perspectives, and get reactions from sample size of the population on how you talk about things. But one of the things we were trying to get to is like you said, what are the understandings? But then, how does that align with what we think we're trying to do? And if you get the very highest level, you get at the highest level of the goals of the GMA. And you talked about some of that, about preserving open space, about, Gene, you said at the beginning, kind of growing within cities to preserve those open spaces long term. And if a lot of people, had a different attitude or felt differently about those objectives, those values, those attitudes, and versus what at the highest level we're trying to do with growth management, we would be having a big disconnect. And maybe and what should we do from that? Is it just an education thing, or is this something for policymakers? We need to sit down and make adjustments. What did we learn from this?
So at the very top line, and you all are the experts, but we're out of town. What I see here is an alignment with what you're trying to do. You didn't hear, for instance, to go archly different, you didn't see a strong push for large lot development in anything you saw here. What you saw here was compact development. Well, my big three takeaways: build cities welcoming to all, and that probably is another way to say price points, affordable price points, welcoming to all, compact development that preserves your open space in the region. That you can read that into the Growth Management Act, and I think you can read that into the 30 years of experience I've had with the city of Issaquah. So you're going through, as Ian said, this rather dramatic development phase where there's always a bit of discomfort. But it sounds to me your values are on track with your voters with perhaps some nuance adjustment. Is that your question, Paul?
Yeah, because one of the things we had discussed at the beginning too, and I haven't heard anything about this, is like, okay, what about some type of campaign? So there's been some education for us, but what other type of kind of communication plan or campaign to help more of the citizens of Issaquah kind of understand this information and get them more part of the conversation?
When we did this presentation with Kurt Triplett at Kirkland, he came back to us the next week and said, I changed the way I'm talking about what we're doing and the way we're presenting it the next week after I saw what you guys did, because I realized we were saying the exact wrong things in every meeting. We were talking to people about all this language they didn't understand, and we weren't emphasizing the imagery, and we weren't emphasizing the three things that Gene just said over and over again. If you don't do that stuff over and over again, we already know we don't have much time with people anyways. So if we're going to spend our time, we got to spend it saying the 4 or 5 things we have to say over and over again. So I would suggest, what did he see within the communications they were doing that he changed? The same opportunity exists in each of the cities we worked in, and it probably exists here too.
And if I recall correctly, you tell me, Ian, Kurt was thinking that we may do a Saturday afternoon public session on your data, this information for at least his residents up in Kirkland, where the residents can see what they're saying, and then hopefully see how it aligns with the city's efforts. So there could be some public sessions that you would want to design with this information and then what the city's doing. Maybe.
Yeah, well, that's for us to take up, and I think with staff as well. I'm glad the DSD chief is here because I think it's his staff as well. I mean, I think there's multiple stakeholders that will benefit, even a landowner here. Thank you.
So I thought that information was really interesting. And maybe I'm the outlier here, but I didn't see anything super surprising. I thought what I saw in the responses was it just validated what we've been hearing for 3 or 4 years. And I think people completely understand we have a plan. And I think largely that plan is a Central Issaquah plan. And I think they understand why we have that plan. And they understand that it means more dense development for saving rural areas and hillsides. And then what we saw tonight was they don't mind the density, but they don't want super tall buildings. So I don't know that we have an education of our citizens problem. I think we had an implementation problem. And I think we are now, I think it's interesting that you said that the other cities thought that maybe folks here were a little more favorable about the question about do they have a voice in, and the perception outside of Issaquah is maybe because we have a moratorium, so we listen to people. But again, I felt all along when I was following along with your slides that it was validating what we've been hearing. So I don't know what I don't know what education. I don't understand what education piece means, so I'll be interested in hearing more about that. But thank you. I thought it was very interesting. Sure.
You did mention, Jean, the possibility of other phases, and in terms of...
Other phases?
Not other phases, but in terms
other
of there's
phases.
more information that could be collected and could be talked about, and I'm not sure where our city council wants to go with it, but one thing in the future, if we are going to be looking at something that would be very interesting to me is to understand where each of the cities in a study are in terms of how, we may find out that Redmond's going to cross the finish line 10 years earlier. So in terms of job targets and housing targets and all of that, it'd be nice to know where we all are on that spectrum. So that would be helpful if we end up having a second phase or more studies or whatever. That'd be very interesting.
So there were some of the things here I did not find surprising. I found that 49% of the people said that our city didn't seem to have a plan for growth to be stunning. I think I think we have to take a long, hard look at what that particular number means. I find that really, really concerning, given how much time we all spend. I mean, heavens, there's entire political races around here that have to do with whether the plans that we have are the right plans or not. And so for 49% to say we don't seem to have a plan is really amazing to me, and really honestly makes me feel like we need to rethink how we're communicating what we do.
So I found that particular response interesting as well, and I found myself inserting words like effective plan or good plan, or yes, it needs to be unpacked. I think the population understands that we plan for things. I just don't, I think if you unpacked it, it would be, my own feeling is that it was, you don't have a complete plan for growth or a effective one. That's how I read that, but doesn't mean that I don't know, I'm assuming.
Can I interject something here? I mentioned the Mercer Island example. I never actually explained it. So I think this fits exactly what you're talking about. So Mercer Island has already been through this. They're through the other side. And we were doing citizen surveys for them every 2 years. And as we saw the downtown plan development coming, all this anxiety shot up. And people were saying, I'm worried about downtown. This seems like an awful idea. Council members were a little worried. They're like, we're hearing all these negative, people are telling us bad things. All the cars are coming in. We're going to change the island irrevocably. And we kept doing those surveys up and through when the construction was done. And then the other end of this, we asked, all right, well, tell us what you think about downtown. We love it. It's fantastic. So this is an example of what both of you were saying. You've got these plans in place. Not everyone necessarily knows what they are, but you heard the right things coming out of the values that you heard in your plan. But now you have to wait to get to the other side before everyone can see it, right? That's part of,
Or
that's.
work on those plans.
Right, but that's the 40-ish% that you were talking about, right? That they may not know that's there, but you know that the values that you heard today.
49,
Right,
almost
49, sorry, yeah. But you know that the values that you were seeing were reflected there. So that, if that helps marry those two at all, maybe it doesn't, maybe it made it worse, but that was my anecdote that I think helps marry the two of those.
Well, yeah, except I think there's a, I would say there's a in-between there. So, and that is, you might have a plan, but it doesn't mean that it's the right plan or it's a good plan. And so I think there's a difference there. And so what we've heard from folks is, we don't like your plan. There might be a plan, but a lot of them don't like it. And so that's what we're in the middle of fixing right now, trying to fix that plan.
Yeah,
Just to follow on, that might be something that would be worth unpacking a little bit further to see how much of it is. Because, I mean, the question is, which statement is closer to your opinion? My city has a clear plan for how to grow and accommodate more residents, or my city doesn't seem to have a plan for growth? Yeah, the further identification of, my city has a plan, but I don't like it. Right?
Yeah, I wouldn't take the term plan too literal. I think what they want to know is there's a common sense of direction. And I think that's what you're all saying. Listening to this council, I'm thinking if there is a phase two, it'd be interesting for your council, and we ask it of the other two councils as well. What is it you want to learn more about in terms of either your citizens or in terms of how this relates to on-the-ground data? Again, like jobs versus housing. And if you want we could bring council members from the three cities together and say, okay, if there's a phase two, what is it that these three cities want to learn more about? And we could host a meeting like that, if that's of use, so that we would want to hear from you guys if that's of use.
Yeah, like Minnie said, there's a lot of stuff that felt like we kind of knew, and now we've verified a little bit. Some of the things I think stuck out for me a little bit was a little bit of a surprise, that the density seemed to be an okay term, and that in Issaquah in particular, our folks said developers were to blame more so than regional growth. And that developers were doing it, not the economy. So they really focused on people, the people there that are doing the building. And then the other thing that followed that was, but they want to see it well designed. They're okay with the density as long as they see it well designed. And so that lack of, I think, a little bit of the quality of the design, what we're doing is not being done well, kind of thing. So it kind of fits in there a little bit of okay with density if you do it right, which I think is a little surprised because I'm not hearing that from a lot of folks directly of that. So I think that followed through. And then we're the one city that was putting some of that blame much more on the developers than on the general economy.
Mariah?
I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, and it was great to hear that some of the information is really what we had thought. So it was really helpful to me. But I think that it does show that we need to focus on more education in terms of our plan. What the plan is and growth, and even though we've got a good rating, and that makes me feel good in terms of people saying, I feel like I have a voice, I'd like to see that grow in the future. So, and I do think that there might be some interesting things that we could pull out and dive into a little bit deeper that would be helpful for us in the future if we were able to go down that road. I'd be interested in that. Thank you.
I think we should end. Is it 81 or 87 like to live here? What was that percentage? We're 89, right? Do I have that right? 90. 90. That is an astounding figure to me. There are a few cities that could claim that kind of favorability rating. So for all the, and Ian has said this throughout the presentation, but for all the difficulty, and as Ian says, of getting out the other side in terms of your growth plan, That is an astounding number, and that's probably, when I think of other cities around the region in the country, you can build on a sense, a kind of reservoir of goodwill or acceptance here. That's a number that a lot of councils would just die for. So good for you all, and it's an opportunity to, you don't need to reverse yourselves, you don't need to reverse your direction. I think it's just about execution, which you're all understanding well.
I don't think we've talked about reverse. So, any other questions?
Great.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Okay, the last item on our agenda is reports on regional activities and issues. Does anybody have any reports? Paula?
I just want to reiterate with folks this, there was an email that went out about the SCA 2018 legislative agenda, and please take a look at that. I think at our next council meeting for good of the order, I will actually walk us through the specific language. It's short, but there's 3 items that I'd like to go through. So please take a look between now and then if you would, and be ready to give me thoughts that you have in regards to that I can pass along. Thank you.
Mary Lou?
On October 20th, I attended the Greater Issaquah Chamber of Commerce board meeting. We talked about the King County Island annexation, community grants, VIX vertical mixed use portion of the moratorium, the council decision to put a moratorium in place on shell site locations, the transit-oriented development project, and the potential piloting of a multifamily tax exemption, Southeast 43rd funding proposal, transportation benefit district, and potential sales tax increase. And there was a question that needs some follow-up. They're interested in the LTAC RFP that might come out this year for marketing proposals. The EFR Finance Administration Committee is meeting on this Thursday. Councilmember Tola Martz is standing in for 3 absent regulars. The one item on the agenda is a potential new revenue source, a fee that would be collected for motor vehicle accident responses.
Anybody else? All right, seeing nothing else, we are adjourned. Have something, Paul?
Did we have other action? No.
Oh, she used the hammer.
Found that hammer.